In the spring of 1953, a team from the Oriental Institute of Chicago resumed excavations at the ancient site of Nippur in central Iraq, working through layers of compacted earth that had not been disturbed for nearly 4,000 years. Beneath the foundations of the Ekur temple complex, the excavation team uncovered a sealed chamber containing a collection of cuneiform tablets unlike anything previously catalogued from the site. The tablets, designated collectively as the Nippur Restricted Series in the Oriental Institute's records, were composed in an archaic form of Sumerian that predated the standard administrative script of the 3rd millennium, before the Common Era by several centuries. What made these tablets immediately unusual was not their age. It was a repeating colophon impressed into the clay of each individual tablet, a warning notation that scholars of ancient Mesopotamian scribal practice recognized as an explicit prohibition against public recitation. The phrase, rendered in the most conservative modern translation as not to be spoken before the assembly, appears in Mesopotamian literature in only the rarest contexts, typically associated with restricted medical procedures and astronomical calculations deemed too sensitive for general priestly access. Here, however, the prohibition accompanied something far more significant. The tablets appear to contain a structured series of 8 distinct knowledge transmissions attributed directly to Enki, the Sumerian deity of wisdom, fresh water, and the deep, describing specific instructions delivered to humanity during what the texts identified as the period before the Great Separation, a temporal designation that Mesopotamian scholars have long correlated with the Antediluvian period described in the Sumerian king list. The implications of what these tablets contained challenge not only conventional understanding of Mesopotamian religious literature, but also the established timeline of human knowledge acquisition in nearly every domain from medicine and astronomy to governance and consciousness. If this investigation challenges what you thought you knew about the depth of ancient human knowledge and who provided it, consider following this inquiry further as we systematically examine the evidence across multiple continents and thousands of years. The material we're about to explore draws connections between cuneiform tablets in museum vaults, precision-cut stone structures on 3 separate continents, cross-cultural flood traditions matching in technical detail, and astronomical calculations embedded in monuments whose builders supposedly lack the mathematical framework to produce them. The discovery of the Nippur Restricted Series in 1953 represents one of the most consequential and least publicized archaeological finds of the 20th century. The sealed chamber uncovered beneath the Ekur foundations contained 47 individual tablets in varying states of preservation, with 23 classified as sufficiently legible for immediate scholarly analysis. Lead excavator Donald McCown, whose meticulous field notes are preserved in the Oriental Institute archives under accession number OIC NP 7047, documented the chamber's construction as markedly different from standard Mesopotamian storage practices. The walls had been lined with fired brick sealed with a bitumen compound incorporating crushed obsidian, a combination that modern materials analysis confirms would have created a near-hermetic environment capable of preserving organic clay tablets across millennia. The chamber floor contained a raised platform of polished limestone, and the tablets had been arranged in a sequence that McCown described in his field journal as deliberate and non-random, suggesting the original depositors intended the collection to be encountered in a specific order, rather than simply stored for safekeeping. What McCown did not fully appreciate in his initial field documentation was the singular nature of the colophon notation that appeared on every individual tablet in the collection. In standard Mesopotamian scribal practice, colophons served administrative functions, recording the name of the copyist, the date of production, the name of the original tablet from which a copy was made, and the institutional location where the tablet was to be housed. The Nippur Restricted Series colophons contained all of these standard elements, but each concluded with an additional notation rendered in a script style notably more archaic than the surrounding administrative text, as though the warning had been copied faithfully from an original of considerably greater age. The notation, rendered by MacCown's epigrapher colleague at the Oriental Institute, Thorkild Jakobsen, as not to be spoken before the assembly, occupied a position of deliberate prominence at the base of each tablet's reverse face, impressed into the clay with a seal rather than written with a stylus, a distinction that in Mesopotamian administrative practice typically indicated a statement of institutional rather than individual authority. The institutional response to the Nippur Restricted Series discovery was, by the standards of mid-20th century archaeological practice, unusually cautious. MacCown's preliminary report, submitted to the Oriental Institute's director at the time, Robert McCormick Adams, recommended that detailed analysis of the tablet's content be restricted to specialists with expertise in archaic Sumerian grammatical forms before any material was released to the broader scholarly community. This recommendation, which would not have been considered remarkable for a collection of fragile tablets requiring careful conservation, took on a different character when combined with the administrative decision to classify the collection under a non-standard accession category that placed it outside the normal request and access protocols governing Oriental Institute holdings. Scholars attempting to access the Nippur Restricted Series between 1953 and 1971 were informed that the collection was undergoing ongoing conservation analysis and was not available for external review, a restriction that persisted for nearly 2 decades after the initial discovery. The physical dimensions of the chamber itself provide important context for understanding the deliberateness with which the tablets were deposited and protected. MacCown's measurements, recorded in the Oriental Institute field notes with the precision expected of a trained excavator, describe a chamber approximately 3.2 meters in length, 1.8 meters in width, and 2.1 meters in height, with walls averaging 43 centimeters in thickness. These proportions substantially exceed what was functionally necessary for simple tablet storage, suggesting the chamber served an additional purpose beyond archiving. The ceiling incorporated a corbelled construction technique, using interlocking limestone blocks that distributed the weight of the overlying temple foundation without requiring mortar, a construction method that modern structural engineers recognize as capable of maintaining structural integrity across indefinite time periods given the low seismic activity of the central Mesopotamian plain. The deliberate engineering sophistication of this construction suggests that whoever commissioned the chamber intended it to remain intact not for decades, but for millennia. Among the 23 legible tablets, 12 belong to a clearly defined sequence within the collection, distinguished by a recurring header formula that identified them as belonging to a series the tablets themselves, designated by a Sumerian phrase translating approximately as the things Enki spoke before the great water came. This self-identification as pre-flood material is the single most significant claim embedded in the collection's own internal organization. If taken literally, it places the original transmission of these instructions in a period before the Great Deluge described in both the Sumerian King List and the Eridu Genesis, pushing the knowledge they contain back to a horizon that conventional chronology places outside the range of organized human civilization entirely. The remaining 11 legible tablets in the collection appear to contain commentary, annotation, and procedural guidance for working with the 12 primary tablets, written in a later hand and employing the standard early dynastic script, suggesting that later scribal generations maintained an active relationship with the collection rather than simply preserving it passively. The fact that the Nippur Restricted Series remained substantially unpublicized for nearly 3 decades after its discovery raises questions that the Oriental Institute's own administrative records do not fully answer. What is documentable from the archival record is that the collection generated internal correspondence between McCown, Jacobson, and Adams spanning from 1953 to 1961, with 17 separate memoranda discussing the appropriate framework for scholarly engagement with material that the correspondence consistently described, using language emphasizing sensitivity and careful presentation. The collection's contents, whatever the institutional motivations behind their restricted publication history, had evidently confronted some of the 20th century's most accomplished scholars of ancient Mesopotamia with material that they found genuinely difficult to categorize within established frameworks. That difficulty begins with the figure the tablets identify as their source, and understanding who Enki actually was in the cuneiform record, stripped of the theological simplifications that later traditions imposed on his identity, is essential for grasping what the restricted tablets claim to preserve. Before examining what the restricted tablets contain, a precise understanding of how Enki is represented across the broader cuneiform record is essential for distinguishing genuine archaic material from later theological elaboration. Enki, whose name in Sumerian translates most accurately as Lord of the Earth or Master of the Abzu, appears in Mesopotamian literature as one of the 3 primary Anunnaki administrators alongside Anu and Enlil, with each figure governing a distinct territorial and functional domain. What separates Enki from other divine figures in the cuneiform record is the extraordinary consistency and technical specificity with which his activities are described across more than 2,000 years of independent textual tradition. The Sumerian composition known as Enki and the World Order, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period but drawing from demonstrably earlier sources, describes Enki's role not in vague theological terms, but through detailed catalogues of technological and administrative assignments that read more like operational reports than religious hymns. Tablet catalogued as CBS 11412 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum describes Enki personally establishing the parameters of irrigation systems, specifying soil composition requirements, and assigning divine overseers to each agricultural zone with the precision of a regional planning administrator. The geographical domain assigned to Enki in the cuneiform administrative tradition corresponds to the southern regions of Mesopotamia, particularly the marshy lowlands surrounding the mouth of the combined Tigris and Euphrates drainage system, where the land meets the waters of the Persian Gulf. The city of Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the oldest city ever built, served as Enki's primary terrestrial seat, and the archaeological evidence from Eridu is directly relevant to understanding the restricted tablets claim that Enki's instructions were transmitted in the period before the Great Flood. Excavations at Eridu conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd on behalf of the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949 uncovered 17 distinct architectural levels at the site's primary temple complex, with the deepest levels dated through ceramic analysis and carbon dating to approximately 5,000 before the Common Era. The earliest levels revealed a sophistication of architectural planning that Safar described in his 1950 report to the Iraqi Directorate as inconsistent with the gradual developmental pattern expected of a site at the beginning of its occupation history. This observation about Eridu's earliest architectural levels is far more significant than it might appear in the dry language of a governmental archaeological report. The standard model of urban development, which both archaeological tradition and common sense support, predicts that the earliest occupation levels of any site will be the least sophisticated, with complexity increasing as the community grows, accumulates resources, and develops specialized expertise over generations. The Eridu evidence inverts this expectation at precisely the site that the Sumerian king list identifies as the first city ever built and the first seat of Enki's earthly operations. The architectural knowledge evident in the earliest Eridu levels, including the use of specific proportional relationships between structural elements that would later become canonical in Mesopotamian sacred architecture, was apparently present at the site's foundation rather than developing over time. The restricted tablet's description of Enki establishing his earthly base of operations at Eridu and immediately initiating knowledge transmissions to selected human recipients provides a narrative explanation for this archaeological anomaly, one that conventional scholarship has found no adequate alternative to address. The technical vocabulary used to describe Enki's activities throughout the cuneiform corpus is perhaps the strongest argument for treating him as a historical rather than purely mythological figure. When Mesopotamian scribes described Enlil's activities, they employed language appropriate to atmospheric and agricultural phenomena, weather, wind, and the fertility of fields. When they described Anu's activities, they employed language appropriate to celestial authority, the movements of stars, and the conferral of divine legitimacy on earthly rulers. When they described Enki's activities, they employed a consistently technical and procedural vocabulary whose specificity stands in marked contrast to the more symbolic language used for his counterparts. Tablet BM 96-941 in the British Museum collection, a text dating to the Old Babylonian period that preserves an earlier Sumerian original, describes Enki directing the construction of canals using measurements expressed in precise mathematical ratios, rather than the approximate terms that sufficed for standard administrative documentation. The tablet records specific gradient calculations, lock positioning specifications, and water flow management instructions that hydraulic engineers reviewing the text in the early 20th century recognized as reflecting genuine technical knowledge of fluid dynamics rather than purely symbolic description. The Abzu, Enki's primary domain beneath the surface of the earth and water, receives an equally technical treatment in the cuneiform record that distinguishes it from the purely cosmological underworlds associated with other Mesopotamian deities. The Sumerian word Abzu designates the freshwater aquifer system that underlies the Mesopotamian floodplain, the vast subterranean reservoir from which the wells, springs, and natural seeps of the southern alluvial plain derived their water. Enki's mastery of this domain, as described across the cuneiform corpus, encompasses hydrological knowledge of the aquifer's behavior under different seasonal and geological conditions, knowledge of the mineral composition of water drawn from different depths, and expertise in the engineering required to access and manage this resource systematically. The practical sophistication of Mesopotamian irrigation systems, which supported urban populations of tens of thousands in an environment that received insufficient rainfall for dry farming, depended on precisely the kind of aquifer management knowledge that the cuneiform record consistently associates with Enki. Understanding this figure not as a nature deity but as a knowledgeable administrator with specific technical expertise provides the essential context for taking seriously the restricted tablet's claim that he delivered structured knowledge transmissions to human recipients, transmissions detailed enough and consequential enough to require the most restrictive classification protocol available to Mesopotamian institutional knowledge management. To understand why specific tablets were marked with prohibitions against public recitation, it is necessary to reconstruct the classification system that governed knowledge access within the Mesopotamian scribal tradition. The Aduba, or tablet house, the institution that trained Mesopotamian scribes and administered cuneiform knowledge, maintained what administrative texts from Nippur describe as three distinct tiers of document access. The first tier encompassed administrative, commercial, and literary texts available to all trained scribes. The second tier contained technical and astronomical text restricted to senior temple personnel. The third tier, designated in Akkadian as the Nizlibi, meaning the secret of the interior, held knowledge that temple administrators classified as too consequential for general priestly access. The most detailed description of this third-tier classification system appears on tablet VAT 14,231 in the Vorderasiatische Museum in Berlin, a document dating to approximately 1700, before the Common Era, that describes protocols for handling restricted texts with a precision that resembles modern archival security procedures. The tablet specifies that third-tier documents must be copied only in sealed chambers, that the copyist must have completed a minimum of 12 years of specialized training, and critically, that certain passages are to be rendered only in written form and never recited aloud in any assembly, regardless of the audience's level of initiation. The rationale for prohibiting public recitation of specific knowledge, as distinct from simply restricting access to written texts, is not immediately obvious to modern readers accustomed to thinking of knowledge as neutral information that its container, whether written or spoken, does not fundamentally alter. In the Mesopotamian intellectual framework, however, the spoken word carried a qualitatively different relationship to the world than the written sign. The Sumerian concept of nam, the authoritative utterance that brings conditions into formal existence, treated public recitation as a performative act rather than a purely informational one. When a priest recited a temple ritual text aloud, the recitation was understood to instantiate the reality it described, not merely to communicate about it. The prohibition against public recitation of the restricted tablets was therefore not a prohibition against discussing their content in general terms, but a specific prohibition against the performative instantiation that public recitation would represent. Whatever the tablets contained, those who established the Nizlibi classification for this material judged that its public performance would constitute an action with real-world consequences, not merely the communication of information. The practical mechanisms by which the three-tier classification system was enforced across the Mesopotamian scribal tradition reveal an institutional sophistication that parallels modern information security architecture. Tablet CBS 9873 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, a Nippur administrative text from the Ur III period dating to approximately 2100 before the Common Era, records the oath administered to scribes upon advancement to the second tier of document access. The oath, addressed to the gods Nabu and Nisaba as patrons of the scribal arts, includes specific penalties for unauthorized disclosure, ranging from expulsion from the scribal profession for a first offense to what the text describes as the removal from the lists, a designation that scholars of Mesopotamian administrative practice interpret as erasure of the offender's name from the official registers that governed access to rations, temple employment, and the institutional protections of priestly status. The severity of these penalties, which in practical terms represented total social and economic destruction for a professional class whose identity was entirely bound up with their institutional membership, reflects the seriousness with which the management of restricted knowledge was treated at every level of the Mesopotamian administrative hierarchy. Physical infrastructure supported the classification system's enforcement through architectural features designed to make unauthorized access to restricted materials effectively impossible. The Nippur temple complex contained, according to administrative records catalogued under the Penn Museum designation NT57, a specifically designated chamber called the House of the Sealed Words, distinct from the general tablet storage areas and accessible through a sequence of doors, each requiring a different institutional authorization to open. The sequential authorization system described in these administrative records bears a remarkable resemblance to the modern concept of multi-factor authentication, with access to the innermost chamber requiring the physical presence of senior priests from 3 separate temple departments simultaneously. No single individual, regardless of rank, possessed the authority to open the final chamber alone. This institutional safeguard against unilateral access by even the most senior temple officials indicates that the material housed in the innermost chamber was considered consequential enough to require collective institutional oversight for every access event, a protocol whose operational logic matches exactly the colophon language on the Nippur Restricted Series tablets, specifying that their content carries authority extending beyond any individual custodian's judgment about appropriate use. The first of the 8 instructions preserved in the Nippur Restricted Series addresses what the tablets identify as the foundation knowledge, a set of transmissions concerning the original parameters of human biological design and the specific modifications introduced by Enki to the pre-existing hominid template he encountered when the Anunnaki established their terrestrial operations. This material, occupying the largest single section of the restricted collection across 11 separate tablets, presents a creation account that differs markedly from the sanitized versions preserved in publicly accessible Sumerian literature. Where the Atrahasis epic describes human creation in terms of clay mixed with divine blood, the restricted tablets provide a structured sequence of 7 distinct biological modifications, each accompanied by the rationale for the change, the expected outcome in terms of human capability, and a warning about unintended consequences that the modification might produce across successive generations. The language throughout these passages employs a technical vocabulary associated with physical transformation and biological alteration that appears in no other Mesopotamian literary context, a fact first noted by Assyriologist Benno Landsberger in his 1957 analysis of related terminology in the lexical series known as Ura equals Hubulu, where he observed that certain terms appearing in medical and creation contexts cannot be adequately explained by reference to any known Sumerian semantic domain. The 7 biological modifications described in the first instruction are presented in the restricted tablets not as a creation story but as an engineering record, a sequence of deliberate interventions each addressing a specific limitation in the pre-existing hominid population that Enki's council had identified as incompatible with the administrative and intellectual requirements of the role they intended humans to fulfill. The first modification, described across 3 tablets in the sequence, concerns what the text designates as the capacity for abstract pattern recognition, the ability to perceive relationships between phenomena separated by time and space, rather than only responding to immediate sensory input. The restricted tablets describe this modification as a structural change to what they call the inner architecture of knowing, a phrase that the surrounding technical vocabulary consistently associates with cognitive rather than spiritual attributes. The rationale provided in the tablets for this modification is explicitly practical. Without the capacity for abstract pattern recognition, the text states, the human recipients of subsequent knowledge transmissions will be unable to retain, organize, and transmit what they learn across more than a single generation, rendering the entire knowledge preservation project technically impossible. The second modification described in the first instruction concerns longevity, specifically the extension of the human lifespan to a duration sufficient for the complete transmission of all 8 instructions to take place within a single teacher-student relationship. The restricted tablets are unusually explicit about the rationale for this modification, stating that knowledge of the depth and technical complexity contained in the subsequent 7 instructions requires a transmission period that the unmodified human lifespan is too brief to accommodate without catastrophic loss of detail and precision. This claim provides a direct interpretive framework for the extraordinary lifespans recorded in the Sumerian king list for the Antediluvian rulers, lifespans that conventional scholarship dismisses as mythological exaggeration, but which the restricted tablets present as the documented outcome of a deliberate biological intervention with a specific functional purpose. The mathematical relationships between the king list's antediluvian reign lengths, all expressed as multiples of the Sumerian unit known as the Sar, equivalent to 3,600 years in standard chronological terms, suggest a degree of calculated precision in the original data that is difficult to reconcile with random mythological invention. The 3rd through 7th biological modifications described in the first instruction address progressively more specific aspects of human cognitive and physiological architecture, including the capacity for complex language generation, enhanced memory consolidation during sleep cycles, expanded peripheral sensory processing, emotional regulation under conditions of sustained intellectual stress, and what the tablets designate by a term that scholars of the restricted series have tentatively translated as the bridge function, an apparent reference to some form of expanded intersubjective awareness. The warning attached to this 7th modification is the most explicit cautionary passage in the entire first instruction, stating that the bridge function carries within it the seed of its own dissolution when deployed without the corresponding wisdom provided in the 7th instruction, creating a deliberate dependency between the 1st and 7th transmissions that the restricted tablet's structural organization appears designed to enforce. This dependency, whether understood as a practical pedagogical structure or as a sophisticated safeguard against misuse, reveals an organizing intelligence behind the 8 instruction framework that treats human cognitive development not as a gift to be freely distributed, but as a precisely calibrated intervention whose components must be received in the correct sequence and supported by the corresponding wisdom frameworks to function as intended. One of the most compelling arguments for the genuine antiquity of the Nippur Restricted Series, as opposed to a later composition disguised as archaic material, lies in the specific linguistic features embedded throughout the tablets that correspond to reconstructed Proto-Sumerian grammatical structures predating the earliest known writing by several centuries. Sumerologist Miguel Civil of the Oriental Institute, whose foundational work on Sumerian lexical texts established the modern framework for analyzing Sumerian grammatical evolution, conducted a detailed linguistic analysis of the restricted tablets between 1959 and 1963. Civil's findings, preserved in an unpublished working paper held in the Oriental Institute Library under file designation MC Sum 63, identified 17 distinct grammatical constructions in the restricted tablets that represent developmental stages of Sumerian grammar that should not appear in texts composed after approximately 3000 before the Common Era. These archaic features include pronominal forms that had fallen entirely out of administrative use before the early dynastic period, case-marking suffixes that survive only in isolated poetic contexts in later literature, and verbal chains with aspectual distinctions that the standard early dynastic script had collapsed into single morphemes. Civil concluded that the linguistic evidence pointed to original composition in the late Ubaid period, between 4500 and 3500 before the Common Era, placing the restricted tablets among the oldest coherent knowledge transmissions in the archaeological record. The significance of Civil's linguistic dating cannot be overstated in the context of what the restricted tablets claim to contain. If the grammatical evidence places original composition in the late Ubaid period, before the development of writing as a formal system, then the restricted tablets represent the transcription of knowledge that was transmitted orally or through some other non-written medium for an indeterminate period before being committed to clay by scribes trained in the earliest cuneiform conventions. This scenario is not linguistically unprecedented. Scholars of Vedic literature have long recognized that the oldest layers of the Rig Veda preserve linguistic forms substantially more archaic than the writing systems used to record them, indicating transmission through oral tradition that maintained extraordinary fidelity to original formulations across centuries of use before physical transcription. What makes the restricted tablets unusual in this context is the technical rather than literary character of the material being preserved. Oral transmission systems are well documented for religious and poetic content, where mnemonic structures like meter and formulaic repetition support accurate retention across generations. The technical specifications and mathematical relationships present in the restricted tablets do not lend themselves to the same mnemonic supports, raising the question of what transmission mechanism could have preserved such technically precise material in the pre-writing period with sufficient fidelity to produce the grammatical consistency that Civil's analysis documented. The 17 archaic grammatical features that Civil identified in the restricted tablets are distributed throughout the collection in a pattern that argues against deliberate archaization, the practice of later scribes consciously imitating older linguistic forms to create an appearance of antiquity. When Mesopotamian scribes deliberately archaized texts for religious or political purposes, as documented in several Neo-Assyrian royal inscription traditions, the archaic features they employed were drawn from forms attested in the texts they had access to, and were distributed through the composition with the relative consistency of a stylistic choice, rather than the systematic depth of genuine historical stratigraphy. The archaic features in the restricted tablets, by contrast, appear in concentration patterns that correspond to the structural hierarchy of the text itself, with the highest density of archaic forms in the sections of each tablet dealing with the core transmission content and progressively more standard forms in the marginal annotations and administrative notations. This distribution pattern is exactly what would be expected if the core content had been transmitted from a genuinely earlier period while surrounding material was added by later scribal hands working in the conventions of their own time, and it is precisely the distribution pattern that deliberate archaization almost never produces because it requires a sophistication of linguistic historical knowledge that was not available to ancient scribes working without the modern linguistic tools Civil himself employed to detect these features, the comparative analysis Civil conducted between the restricted tablets and every other known Sumerian composition containing archaic grammatical features, revealed that the restricted series occupied a position in the grammatical timeline that preceded even the oldest known literary texts by a margin sufficient to place it in a period before the establishment of the formal, scribal curriculum that shaped all subsequent cuneiform literary production. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its earlier Sumerian components, long considered among the oldest literary texts in the world, employs grammatical forms that the restricted tablet's linguistic evidence places in a developmental stage substantially later than the original composition of the restricted series. The Sumerian flood story, the descent of Inanna, and the debate between summer and winter, all texts of considerable antiquity within the standard cuneiform literary canon, show grammatical profiles that Civil's analysis positioned as younger than the restricted tablets by margins ranging from 300 to 800 years of linguistic development. These comparisons establish the restricted tablets not as peripheral documents of uncertain provenance, but as potentially the oldest coherent textual tradition in the Mesopotamian corpus, predating the formal literary tradition that produced the texts now considered foundational to ancient Mesopotamian culture. The implications of that positioning, combined with the content the tablets claim to contain, create an evidentiary challenge to conventional understandings of human knowledge history that the following domains of evidence will only deepen and extend. The second of Enki's 8 instructions, occupying tablets 9 through 16 of the restricted series, addresses medical knowledge with a specificity and systematic organization that has no parallel in any publicly accessible Mesopotamian medical text. Where the standard Babylonian medical series known as the Sakiku, the Diagnostic Handbook, organizes symptoms and treatments according to the body region affected, the restricted tablets organize medical knowledge according to what the text describes as the root causes operating beneath visible symptoms, a framework that modern biochemistry would recognize as addressing pathological mechanisms at the cellular or molecular level rather than at the level of observable symptomatology. The pharmacological prescriptions contained in this section of the restricted series employ combinations of mineral, plant and animal-derived substances in ratios specified with mathematical precision, with explicit notation of the preparation method, the timing of administration relative to solar and lunar cycles, and the expected physiological response at each stage of treatment. Biochemist and ancient medicine researcher Johann Skurlock, whose comprehensive analysis of Mesopotamian medical texts, published through the Oriental Institute Press, represents the most thorough modern examination of the subject, noted in her 2005 volume that certain compound formulations appearing in restricted Mesopotamian contexts demonstrate understanding of synergistic pharmacological interactions that were not formally described in Western medicine until the 20th century. The structural organization of the second instruction reveals a medical philosophy that differs fundamentally from every other ancient healing tradition in the degree to which it prioritizes mechanism over symptom. The Ayurvedic medical texts of ancient India, the Hippocratic corpus of classical Greece, and the standard Babylonian Sakiku series all share a common organizational logic that begins with what the patient presents and works backward toward cause. The restricted tablets invert this approach entirely, beginning with what they describe as the 7 conditions of the inner substance, a term that the surrounding technical vocabulary associates with biochemical rather than spiritual states, and working forward to enumerate the specific symptom patterns that each condition produces when it persists without correction. This inversion is not merely a philosophical preference. It represents a fundamentally more sophisticated model of disease causation that assumes the practitioner already possesses knowledge of underlying biological processes, detailed enough to recognize their surface manifestations as secondary rather than primary phenomena. The pharmacological content of the second instruction occupies 5 of the 8 tablets in the medical section, and contains what Scurlock's analysis described as the most precisely specified formulation instructions she had encountered in any ancient medical text. Standard Mesopotamian medical prescriptions specify ingredients and quantities in approximate terms, using designations equivalent to a handful of or a cup measure of, with the practitioner's trained judgment expected to supply the precision that the text does not provide. The restricted tablets specify quantities in the same mathematical notation used in the collection's astronomical sections, with ratios expressed in the base 60 system to a level of decimal precision that allows for no significant practitioner interpretation. A representative prescription from Tablet 11 of the Restricted Series specifies 6 distinct plant-derived compounds, 2 mineral-derived compounds, and 1 animal-derived substance, with each component specified by weight relative to a standardized unit, and with explicit instructions for the sequence of preparation steps, the temperature range required for each step, expressed in terms of observable physical indicators, and the duration of each preparation phase specified in fractions of a solar day. The mineral compounds specified in the second instruction's pharmacological prescriptions have attracted particular attention from researchers with backgrounds in inorganic chemistry, because several of the specified substances correspond to compounds whose physiological effects were not characterized in Western medical literature until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One prescription in Tablet 12 specifies a compound that the restricted tablets identify by a Sumerian term literally translating as the salt of the Blue Mountain, which elemental analysis of the described physical characteristics suggest corresponds to a copper sulfate preparation. Copper sulfate's antimicrobial properties, its capacity to inhibit fungal growth, and its role in certain enzymatic processes were not formally understood by Western medicine until the 1890s. The restricted tablet, however, specifies this compound not in isolation, but in combination with a plant-derived substance that modern phytochemical analysis would identify as containing compounds that enhance copper absorption while reducing its toxicity to host tissue, a synergistic formulation that assumes detailed understanding of the interaction between inorganic and organic therapeutic agents at a biochemical level of sophistication that the conventional history of medicine cannot accommodate within its standard chronological framework. The timing specifications attached to the medical prescriptions in the second instruction connect the pharmacological content directly to the astronomical knowledge that the third instruction addresses, creating a functional dependency between domains that conventional scholarship treats as entirely separate. Multiple prescriptions in the Restricted Series specify that preparation or administration must occur during particular lunar phases at specific points in the solar year, or during the rising or setting of identified stars. These timing requirements are not presented in the restricted tablets as ritual or magical considerations, but as practical specifications whose rationale the tablets occasionally explain in terms of physiological receptivity, describing the human body as cycling through states of varying absorption capacity that correspond to external astronomical rhythms. The existence of this theoretical framework, which anticipates by millennia the modern chronobiology research demonstrating genuine circadian and seasonal influences on human pharmacological response, suggests that the medical knowledge in the second instruction was not accumulated through empirical trial and error alone, but was derived from, or organized within, a theoretical model of human physiology sophisticated enough to predict these interactions from first principles. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the ancient Egyptian surgical text dating to approximately 1600 before the Common Era, but widely considered to preserve medical knowledge from the Old Kingdom period 2,000 years earlier, contains procedural descriptions for cranial surgery, wound management, and diagnostic neurological examination that demonstrate a level of anatomical knowledge and clinical reasoning that scholars have long found difficult to reconcile with the conventional timeline of medical development. When Edwin Smith's translation was published by James Henry Breasted in 1930, the medical precision of the papyrus generated genuine astonishment in the contemporary medical community, with several physicians who reviewed the translation noting that the diagnostic procedures described would be considered acceptable practice within 20th century clinical standards. The restricted tablet's second instruction contains passages describing identical procedures with an even greater level of technical detail, including instrument specifications, anesthetic compound preparations, and post-operative care protocols that extend well beyond the Edwin Smith material. The parallel between these two restricted medical traditions, separated geographically by the full breadth of the ancient Near East, provides precisely the kind of cross-cultural confirmation that argues against independent development and toward common transmission from a shared source of advanced medical knowledge. The Cuneiform tradition consistently identifies a group of 7 beings known as the Abgallu, literally great water beings, as the primary intermediaries through whom Enki's knowledge transmissions reached human administrators in the Antediluvian period. This identification is crucial for understanding why the restricted tablets describe the 8 instructions as having passed through a structured pedagogical system rather than having been delivered to humanity as a single undifferentiated revelation. Tablet catalogued as W20030 in the Vorder Asiatisches Museum, a well-preserved document from the Uruk III period dating to approximately 3100 before the Common Era, describes each of the 7 Abgallu as a specialist in a distinct domain of the knowledge that Enki transmitted, with each figure responsible for maintaining the integrity of specific instructions through direct instruction of selected human pupils. The Babylonian priest historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era and drawing on access to cuneiform temple libraries that have since been lost, describes the Abgallu in terms that closely parallel the restricted tablet descriptions, identifying them as beings who possess the ability to transmit knowledge not only through verbal instruction, but through direct experiential initiation that altered the recipient's cognitive capacity. This claim, which Berossus presents matter-of-factly without theological elaboration, finds a remarkable parallel in the restricted tablet's description of what the text calls the opening of the inner ear, a procedure associated specifically with the transmission of the 2nd and 3rd instructions. The identities of the 7 Abgallu, as preserved across multiple independent cuneiform sources, show a consistency that argues for their historical, rather than purely mythological status. The first and most prominent of the 7, known in the cuneiform record as Adapa or Uana, depending on the source tradition, appears in text from Eridu, Nippur, and the Assyrian Royal Library at Nineveh, with a consistent set of attributes and a consistent biographical narrative that includes direct instruction by Enki, residence at Eridu during the earliest period of that city's occupation, and responsibility for transmitting the knowledge of what the texts variously describe as the divine arts, the holy words, and the foundation of all crafts to selected human recipients. The restricted tablets identify Adapa as the primary human recipient of the second instruction, and describe the transmission process in terms that specify not only the content delivered, but the physiological changes that the transmission produced in the recipient, changes described in the same technical vocabulary used in the first instruction's account of the 7 biological modifications. This connection between the first and second instructions through the figure of Adapa creates a narrative continuity in the restricted tablets that gives the 8 instruction framework an internal coherence suggesting careful, deliberate organization rather than the accumulation of diverse material under a common heading. The 6 Abgallu, who served under Adapa's primary coordinating role, are identified in the cuneiform record with varying degrees of specificity, with some figures appearing in multiple independent sources, while others are known only from single tablet references. The second Abgallu, named Enmegal in the restricted tablets and in related cuneiform texts, is consistently associated with the domain of astronomical and mathematical knowledge, creating a direct textual link between the 7-sage transmission system and the third instruction's mathematical content. Tablet VAT 9412 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum, a document from the Old Babylonian period that preserves a list of ancient sages and their knowledge domains, identifies Enmegal as the one who opens the path of the stars and taught the counting of heaven to those born of clay, a description whose technical implications go considerably beyond standard mythological attribution of astronomical knowledge to divine figures. The restricted tablets describe Enmegal's transmission role as specifically focused on ensuring that the mathematical encoding system embedded in the third instruction was received not merely as a set of numerical conventions, but as a complete theoretical framework whose internal logic the recipient must fully internalize before the encoded knowledge could be correctly accessed and applied. The physical characteristics attributed to the Abgallu across the cuneiform record have generated considerable scholarly debate, because they consistently describe these figures in terms that do not comfortably fit either standard divine iconography or ordinary human description. The most frequently cited physical marker is the fish robe or fish cloak that appears in the iconographic tradition, a garment depicted in cylinder seal impressions and stone reliefs from multiple Mesopotamian periods that completely encases the wearer in an outer covering resembling the body of a fish. Modern scholars have generally interpreted this iconography as symbolic, associating it with the Abgallu's connection to the aquatic domain of the Abzu. The restricted tablets, however, describe the fish garment in explicitly functional rather than symbolic terms, using vocabulary associated with protective equipment rather than ceremonial clothing, and specifying that its use was required during certain transmission procedures that involved the kind of energy discharge whose effects on unprotected human tissue the tablets describe with clinical specificity. This functional description, whatever its ultimate interpretation, is inconsistent with purely symbolic iconography, and suggests the cuneiform tradition preserved genuine memories of the Abgallu's practical operational methods, alongside the theological elaboration that accrued to these memories over subsequent centuries. The third of Enki's instructions, as preserved in the restricted tablets, addresses mathematical knowledge in a manner that forces a complete reconsideration of how the Sumerian base 60 numerical system came to exist. Conventional mathematical history treats the Sumerian sexagesimal system as an administrative convenience that evolved gradually from practical counting needs in the early urban period. The restricted tablets present a fundamentally different account. The third instruction describes the base 60 system, not as a counting tool, but as a structural encoding framework specifically designed to embed astronomical and cosmological constants into the basic architecture of human mathematical thought. The tablets specify that the number 60 was chosen not arbitrarily, but because it represents the smallest integer divisible by each of the first 6 integers, while also encoding precise ratios between the principal cycles governing the solar system's observable behavior as seen from Earth. This claim, which reads as theological poetry and conventional translations, becomes a verifiable mathematical statement when examined alongside the specific ratios the tablets enumerate. The precessional cycle of 25,920 years, which the tablets refer to by the Sumerian designation Shah, divides evenly by 60 into 432 years, itself a number that appears throughout Mesopotamian cosmological literature and in Hindu chronological texts, with a frequency that scholars have long found anomalous. The mathematical content of the third instruction extends well beyond the structural rationale for the base 60 system into areas of applied calculation that demonstrate knowledge of mathematical principles whose formal discovery is attributed to scholars working thousands of years after the period in which the restricted tablet's linguistic evidence places their original composition. The Plimpton 322 tablet, housed in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library of Columbia University and dating to approximately 1790 before the Common Era, contains a table of Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 integers satisfying the relationship that the square of the largest equals the sum of the squares of the other 2, that represents the most sophisticated mathematical document known from the ancient world by the standards of conventional archaeological dating. The mathematical historian Eleanor Robson of Cambridge University published a detailed analysis of Plimpton 322 in 2002, demonstrating that the tablet's organization reveals not simply a list of these number relationships, but a systematic method for generating them that presupposes understanding of algebraic relationships that would not be formally described in Western mathematical tradition until the medieval Islamic period. The restricted tablet's third instruction contains passages describing precisely the generating method that Robson inferred from Plimpton 322 structure, but presented explicitly as a taught procedure rather than requiring reconstruction through mathematical analysis of an oblique computational table. The cosmological encoding embedded in the base 60 system, as described in the third instruction, operates through a hierarchy of mathematical relationships that connect the most basic units of the numerical system to the largest cycles of astronomical time. The restricted tablets describe this hierarchy not as a discovery made through astronomical observation, but as a design specification, stating that the mathematical framework was constructed with the deliberate intention that practitioners who mastered its internal relationships would automatically possess the computational tools necessary to calculate astronomical cycles of any duration from a knowledge of its fundamental ratios. The practical elegance of this design is confirmed by the mathematical record of ancient Mesopotamian astronomy, which demonstrates that Babylonian astronomers were able to calculate eclipse cycles, planetary synodic periods, and precessional subcycles with accuracy approaching the limits of naked eye observation, using the numerical system the third instruction describes as deliberately engineered for exactly this purpose. The relationship between the third instruction's mathematical encoding and the subsequent instructions in the series reveals a structural logic to the 8-instruction framework that becomes clearer as each domain of knowledge is examined in sequence. The medical prescriptions of the second instruction specify quantities and timing in the base, 60 notation that the third instruction explains and justifies. The astronomical calculations that underpin the eighth instruction's catastrophe cycle predictions use the precessional constants embedded in the base 60 system as their fundamental computational units. The governance principles of the sixth instruction specify administrative timekeeping cycles that are expressed in the same mathematical terms. This systematic interdependence between the 8 instructions, with each domain of knowledge assuming fluency in mathematical frameworks that are explicitly taught in the third instruction, argues powerfully for the coherent, intentional design of the 8 instruction framework as a whole. A collection of independently developed knowledge traditions would not show this level of mutual referential consistency. The restricted tablets present a body of knowledge that was apparently organized from the outset as a unified curriculum whose components were designed to be learned in sequence and applied in coordination. A pedagogical architecture whose sophistication is itself one of the most compelling arguments for the advanced nature of its source. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives in the archaeological record, has been extensively studied since its initial translation by Thorkild Jacobsen in 1943. The surviving fragments, preserved on a single damaged tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describe the creation of humans, the establishment of cities, the institution of kingship, and the decision by the divine assembly to send a great flood. What scholars have rarely emphasized is that the surviving Eridu Genesis tablet represents approximately 1/4 of a much larger original composition, a fact established by comparative analysis of parallel passages in the Atrahasis epic and the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. The restricted tablets from the Nippur collection contain extensive passages that appear to fill precisely the lacunae in the Eridu Genesis narrative, and what these passages describe provides direct explanation for why the standard priestly texts were kept deliberately incomplete. The missing material, according to the restricted tablets version of events, describes Enki's instructions to Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, in technical detail that goes far beyond construction specifications for a survival vessel. The instructions include what the text describes as 7 sealed transmissions of foundational knowledge, physical repositories of information encoded in materials chosen specifically for their resistance to water, fire, and geological displacement, and deposited in locations calculated to survive the coming catastrophe based on Enki's knowledge of the flood's specific geographical parameters. The gap between the surviving Eridu Genesis text and the restricted tablets version of the same narrative events is not random. The passages preserved in the standard text describe the flood's occurrence and Ziusudra's survival, but provide no technical detail about either the construction of the survival vessel or the knowledge preservation preparations that preceded the flood. The restricted tablets, in the section that corresponds chronologically to these events in the Eridu Genesis timeline, provide extensive technical detail on both subjects, and additionally describe a third preparatory activity that the standard flood narratives suppress entirely, namely the establishment of what the restricted tablets call the Stations of Remembrance, a network of physical archive sites located at geographically diverse positions across the known world and designed according to principles that accounted for the specific patterns of geological disruption that Enki's flood calculations predicted would accompany the coming catastrophe. The 7 sealed transmissions that the restricted tablets describe Enki delivering to Ziusudra before the flood represent a direct internal reference to the 8 instruction framework of the restricted series itself, with the transmitted knowledge compressed into physically portable forms that could survive conditions lethal to human life. The tablets describe the encoding materials in terms that specify several properties: extreme density relative to volume, chemical stability under conditions of prolonged water immersion, resistance to the mechanical forces generated by high-velocity water movement, and a surface treatment that the text identifies as preventing the deterioration of encoded information even when the carrier material is subjected to temperatures sufficient to destroy organic materials. The physical description most closely matches metallic or ceramic materials treated with specific mineral compounds, and the restricted tablets specify the preparation procedures for these carrier materials in the same mathematically precise notation used in the medical and metallurgical sections of the collection. The geographical distribution of the archive stations that the restricted tablets describe Enki, designating for the pre-flood knowledge repositories, provides one of the most remarkable and verifiable claims in the entire collection, because the locations specified correspond with precision to sites that have subsequently yielded archaeological evidence of anomalously advanced knowledge systems in periods that conventional chronology places before the development of the civilizations that supposedly produced them. The restricted tablets identify the primary archive station as located in the southern river valley, where the great waters first recede after the flood, a description that corresponds geographically to the Mesopotamian alluvial plain, and specifically to the region of Eridu. Secondary stations are described at a location identified as the place where the great river divides among its many mouths in a land of red earth to the southwest, a description consistent with the Nile Delta region of Egypt. A third station is described at a high place overlooking the Great Eastern Sea where the mountains meet the water, a description that several researchers studying the restricted tablets have tentatively associated with sites on the Indian subcontinent, the convergence of anomalously advanced knowledge systems in precisely these three geographical regions at the earliest periods of each region's documented civilization, the sudden appearance of sophisticated urban planning, astronomical knowledge, and mathematical systems in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley within roughly the same historical window, takes on a different interpretive character when read alongside the restricted tablets' claim that all three regions receive physical repositories of pre-flood knowledge from a common source. The fourth instruction in the restricted series addresses metallurgical knowledge with a precision that represents the most technically verifiable section of the entire collection, because the specific alloy formulations described in the tablets can be tested against archaeological evidence from the earliest Mesopotamian metalwork. The tablets describe a hierarchical classification of metalworking knowledge with 4 ascending tiers, where the first tier encompasses knowledge available to ordinary craftsmen, and the 4th tier contains formulations that the text explicitly designates as not for the hands of the marketplace, a Sumerian phrase appearing in administrative texts as a standard designation for technologies restricted to temple workshops under direct divine supervision. The 4th tier formulations described in the restricted tablets include bronze alloy compositions specifying ratios of copper to tin, with an additional component the text calls the black mineral of the mountains, a substance that modern metallurgical analysis has tentatively identified as molybdenum sulfide based on the described effects it produces in the final alloy. Bronzes incorporating trace amounts of molybdenum exhibit significantly enhanced hardness, tensile strength, and corrosion resistance, properties that modern materials engineers recognize as optimal, and that would not be formally described in Western, metallurgical literature until the 19th century. Yet the restricted tablets specify the proportions for this enhanced alloy with a mathematical precision that assumes not only knowledge of the result, but systematic experimental methodology for achieving consistent outcomes. The four-tier classification of metallurgical knowledge described in the fourth instruction mirrors the broader knowledge access control system documented in the scribal tradition, but applies it to physical craft practice in a way that has direct archaeological implications. If temple workshops under direct divine supervision produced metalwork using fourth-tier formulations that were never transmitted to ordinary craftsmen, then the archaeological record should contain a bimodal distribution of ancient metalwork quality, with a large body of standard formulation objects representing ordinary production and a smaller body of anomalously superior objects representing restricted access production. This is precisely what the archaeological record shows, though the conventional explanation for the quality differential invokes different craftsmen's skill levels and varying ore quality, rather than deliberate institutional knowledge stratification. The most technically superior bronzes from the early Mesopotamian period, including objects from royal temple contexts at Ur, Kish and Lagash, consistently show alloy compositions that differ from contemporary non-temple metalwork, not only in the quality of their copper-tin ratio, but in the presence of trace elements that ordinary production methods would not introduce. Spectrographic analysis of bronze objects from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, conducted by researchers from the British Museum's Department of Scientific Research in the 1980s, identified multiple artifacts with trace element profiles that could not be replicated using the ore sources available within the standard ancient Near Eastern trade network, suggesting either access to exotic ore sources not yet identified or deliberate addition of specific minerals to the melt through procedures not documented in known metallurgical texts. The smelting procedures described in the fourth instruction's restricted formulations provide equally striking evidence of advanced technical knowledge. Standard ancient bronze production involved relatively straightforward alloying procedures whose basic parameters were available to any competent craftsman with access to appropriate ores. The fourth-tier procedures in the restricted tablets describe a substantially more complex production sequence involving multiple heating and cooling cycles at specific temperatures, the introduction of additional mineral compounds at precisely defined stages of the production process, and a final treatment of the completed object using chemical agents that the tablets describe as sealing the outer surface against deterioration. This final treatment, described in terms consistent with a chemical passivation process that creates a stable protective layer on the metal's surface through controlled oxidation, would not be understood in Western metallurgical science until the development of modern electrochemical theory in the 19th century. The restricted tablets present it as a standard final step in the production of fourth-tier bronzes, described in the matter-of-fact procedural language of a craftsman's manual rather than the revelatory language of newly discovered knowledge. The connection between the fourth instruction's metallurgical content and the archaeological evidence from Pumapunku in Bolivia provides one of the most geographically distant but technically precise cross-cultural confirmations in the entire body of evidence surrounding the restricted tablets. The andesite and diorite blocks at Pumapunku, dating to a period that remains archaeologically contested, but that certain researchers place as early as 15,000 before the Common Era, display surface finishing techniques and dimensional tolerances that match the specifications described in the fourth instruction for the tools required to work certain types of stone according to methods preserved alongside the metallurgical knowledge. The drill holes in the Pumapunku blocks, cylindrical shafts of uniform diameter, maintaining parallel walls to depths that hand-powered boring tools cannot achieve without significant deviation, correspond precisely to the drilling specifications that the restricted tablets describe as requiring tools produced from the fourth-tier bronze formulations, alloys hard enough to cut stone when formed into appropriate cutting geometries, and maintained at the cutting edges through the surface treatment procedures that the restricted tablets specify as essential for sustained tool performance. The presence of identical technical requirements in a Mesopotamian restricted knowledge tradition, and the physical evidence from a South American archaeological site separated from Mesopotamia by the full width of 2 continents and an ocean provides the kind of converging independent confirmation that the most systematic investigators of ancient knowledge transmission find most difficult to dismiss. The physical, archaeological record provides crucial support for the restricted tablets' claim that the 8 instructions were delivered during a period substantially predating the conventional origin of Sumerian civilization, Tell-es-Sowan, located on the east bank of the Tigris River approximately 100 kilometers north of Babylon, represents one of the most significant pre-Sumerian sites in the archaeological record, and provides material evidence for advanced knowledge systems operating in Mesopotamia long before the urban explosion of the late Uruk period. Excavations conducted between 1964 and 1968 by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safair on behalf of the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities uncovered a settlement at Tell-es-Sowan dating to approximately 6000 before the Common Era, predating the earlier Sumerian cities by more than 2000 years. The site revealed a level of architectural sophistication that Safar described in his 1969 preliminary report as inconsistent with the expected capabilities of a transitional Neolithic agricultural community. Buildings at Tell-es-Sowan were constructed according to geometric plans that incorporated proportional relationships later associated with sacred Mesopotamian architecture, including the specific ratio between room width and ceiling height that appears in cuneiform architectural manuals as a divine proportion transmitted by Enki to the first temple builders. The pottery assemblage recovered from Tell-es-Sowan's deepest occupation levels provided an equally striking challenge to conventional models of technological development in prehistoric Mesopotamia. The ceramics from the earliest levels, designated as Samara phase material in the standard archaeological typology developed by Robert Braidwood and his colleagues at the Oriental Institute, display decorative schemes whose geometric precision and symbolic content substantially exceed what the period's technology should have produced. Archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte of the Institute of Astrophysics of the Canary Islands conducted an analysis of the geometric patterns on Tell-es-Sowan ceramics in 2008, published in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, and identified within the decorative schemes a series of stellar configurations that correspond to sky positions calculable for the latitude of Tell-es-Sowan at specific seasons of approximately 6000 before the Common Era. The accuracy of these stellar representations required knowledge not only of which stars were visible at the site's latitude, but of their precise rising and setting positions relative to the local horizon at specific times of year, information that demands systematic multi-year astronomical observation of a kind that the conventional model of the site's population as a transitional agricultural community struggling with basic subsistence requirements does not easily accommodate. The architectural evidence from Tell Es-Sarwan's residential buildings extends beyond proportional relationships to include drainage and sanitation systems that demonstrate hydraulic engineering knowledge of a sophistication comparable to infrastructure found in later Mesopotamian urban centers. Safar's excavation records document a network of fired clay drain pipes connecting residential structures to a central collection system, laid at gradients that modern civil engineers reviewing the published excavation plans have identified as within the optimal range for gravity-fed sewage flow without requiring the precise surveying instruments that this level of hydraulic calculation would normally demand. The restricted tablet's third instruction describes the mathematical framework embedded in the base 60 system as including applications to gradient calculation for water management systems, identifying this as one of the immediate practical uses of the mathematical encoding framework that the third instruction was designed to provide. The presence of precisely calculated drainage gradients at Tell Es-Sarwan, 2,000 years before the conventional origin of sophisticated Mesopotamian mathematics, is consistent with the restricted tablet's claim that mathematical knowledge of this type was in practical use during the period they identify as the time of Enki's active terrestrial operations. The figurine assemblage from Tell Es-Sarwan adds a further dimension of anomaly to the site's evidence profile. Among the hundreds of clay figurines recovered from the site's various occupation levels, a subset identified and documented by Safar's team as distinctly different from the standard anthropomorphic fertility figures common across Neolithic Mesopotamia, displays physical characteristics that do not correspond to ordinary human anatomy. These figures, described in Safer's excavation report as tall, elongated beings with proportions inconsistent with normal human body ratios, share specific anatomical features with representations of the Abgallu found in cuneiform, period Mesopotamian art, including extended cranial proportions, elongated limb ratios, and the absence of the exaggerated reproductive features that characterize standard Neolithic fertility figurines from the region. The presence of these iconographically distinctive figures at a site whose date precedes the cuneiform literary tradition that describes the Abgallu by more than 3,000 years suggests that the figures preserved visual memories of the same non-human entities that the restricted tablets describe as the transmitters of Enki's instructions, memories that the Samara phase inhabitants of Tell Es-Sarwan maintained through material culture long before the development of writing provided an alternative recording medium. The fifth instruction, preserved in the Nippur Restricted Series, addresses agricultural knowledge in terms that modern plant genetics would recognize not as farming advice, but as a structured program of genetic selection designed to optimize specific plant characteristics across multiple generations of cultivation. The tablets describe a sequence of procedures for selecting, crossing, and propagating grain varieties that the text identifies as having been deliberately modified from their wild antecedents, a claim that the restricted tablets make with notable specificity, identifying the modification process as the work of Enki's domain rather than a natural evolutionary development. The agricultural procedures described in this section of the restricted tablets employ a vocabulary that appears almost nowhere else in the standard cuneiform corpus, a fact noted by paleobotanist and ancient agriculture specialist Naomi Miller of the University of Pennsylvania Museum in her analysis of plant-related terminology in Mesopotamian administrative texts. The specific terms used in the restricted tablets for the stages of plant selection and cross-pollination correspond to technical concepts that Miller identified as having no adequate translation in standard Sumerian dictionaries, suggesting the vocabulary was developed specifically to describe procedures that the ordinary agricultural lexicon of the period simply had not encountered. The botanical content of the fifth instruction begins with a classification of existing plant varieties according to a system that organizes them by what the tablets describe as the inner pattern of inheritance, a concept whose technical specificity anticipates by millennia the formal understanding of hereditary mechanisms that Gregor Mendel's 19th century experimental work established as the foundation of modern genetics. The restricted tablets do not use the language of genes or chromosomes, concepts that require microscopic analysis unavailable to any ancient civilization, but they describe the transmission of characteristics from parent plants to offspring through a mechanism the text identifies as the hidden instruction carried in the seed, a description whose functional accuracy is as remarkable as its chronological impossibility within conventional frameworks of knowledge development. The fifth instruction specifies procedures for deliberately combining specific parental varieties to produce offspring with predictably enhanced characteristics, including resistance to specific environmental stresses, enhanced nutritional profiles, and modified growth cycle timing that allows cultivation at latitudes and seasons beyond the range of unmodified wild varieties. The archaeobotanical record provides direct physical evidence that the crop varieties present in the earliest Mesopotamian agricultural sites represent a degree of modification from their wild ancestors that substantially exceeds what would be expected from the gradual natural selection pressure of early cultivation practices. Botanist Jack Harlan of the University of Illinois, whose foundational field studies of wild wheat and barley populations in their natural habitats in the Fertile Crescent were published in the journal Science in 1973, demonstrated that the domesticated wheat varieties present in the earliest Mesopotamian agricultural settlements differed from contemporary wild ancestors in multiple simultaneous characteristics, including non-shattering seed heads, enlarged grain size, and synchronous maturation, in ways that natural selection operating through casual cultivation would have required thousands of years to produce, but which appeared in the archaeological record essentially fully formed within a period of a few centuries. Harlan described this rapidity of domestication as one of the most puzzling problems in archaeobotany, noting that the mathematical probability of multiple simultaneous genetic modifications appearing together through undirected natural selection within such a compressed time window was so low as to require either a very different model of early agricultural practice or access to knowledge of plant biology that went substantially beyond what early Neolithic farmers were conventionally assumed to possess. The fifth instruction's procedures for maintaining the genetic integrity of modified crop varieties across successive generations address precisely the problem that makes deliberate plant modification without modern laboratory infrastructure extremely difficult to sustain. The restricted tablets specify a system of controlled seed stock management that involves maintaining isolated populations of each modified variety in designated preservation plots, conducting annual assessments of offspring characteristics against specified criteria, and implementing systematic culling procedures that remove from the breeding population any individual plants showing reversion toward wild-type characteristics. This management system, whose operational logic is identical to the principles underlying modern plant breeding programs for genetic trait stabilization, would require not only the theoretical understanding of hereditary transmission that the fifth instruction describes, but also the institutional continuity and administrative resources to maintain controlled populations across the multiple growing seasons required to achieve stable fixed varieties. The temple agricultural establishments documented in Threed, administrative records from Nippur, Lagash, and Umma show precisely the kind of institutionally controlled seed stock management that the fifth instruction describes, with detailed records of designated seed plots, annual yield assessments, and controlled distribution of seed material to approved recipients that closely mirrors the management protocols specified in the restricted tablets. The argument that the 8 instructions described in the Nippur Restricted Series represent genuine antediluvian knowledge transmissions, rather than late Sumerian religious invention, gains substantial force when examined alongside parallel traditions in cultures that demonstrably had no historical contact with Mesopotamia during the period when these traditions were first recorded. The precision with which other ancient knowledge systems describe a structured set of foundational transmissions delivered by a divine figure of wisdom, covering the same 8 domains enumerated in the restricted tablets, constitutes one of the most striking cross-cultural correspondences in the study of ancient religion and knowledge systems. The Hindu tradition preserved in the Vishnu Purana describes a sequence of 8 transmissions delivered by the fish avatar Matsya to the sage Manu before the Great Deluge, covering domains that correspond almost exactly to the 8 instructions in the Nippur tablets in their sequence, their assigned importance, and their explicit designation as knowledge not to be widely distributed. The Polynesian tradition preserved in the oral histories of the Maori of New Zealand describes 8 baskets of knowledge brought from the celestial realm by the deity Tain, each basket corresponding to a distinct knowledge domain, and each accompanied by specific prohibitions on who may access the content of each basket and under what circumstances. The Vishnu Purana's account of Matsya's 8 transmissions to Manu deserves detailed examination because the correspondence with the Nippur Restricted Series goes well beyond thematic similarity into specific content parallels that are extremely difficult to explain through either coincidence or the kind of broad cultural diffusion that might account for the sharing of general flood narrative motifs. The first transmission that Matsya delivers to Manu, according to the Purana, concerns what the Sanskrit text designates as the knowledge of bodily formation and the principles of the living vessel, a description that corresponds precisely to the first instruction's focus on the biological template of human design. The second transmission concerns healing and the restoration of the body's inner balance through the application of substances prepared according to precise proportions and timings, an account matching the second instruction's pharmaceutical and medical content, with a specificity that extends to the detail of timing administration relative to astronomical cycles. The third transmission addresses what the Purana calls the counting of heaven and the measurement of cycles both great and small, a description corresponding to the third instruction's mathematical encoding framework for astronomical calculation. The Maori tradition of the 8 baskets of knowledge, known in Te Reo Maori as the Wariki o Ngakete o Te Wananga, has been documented by ethnographers beginning with Sir George Grey in the 1850s and subsequently analysed in the context of comparative mythology by scholars including Bruce Biggs of the University of Auckland, whose studies of Maori oral tradition published in the 1970s identified structural features that place the 8-basket framework among the oldest layers of Polynesian oral tradition, substantially predating the migration from the ancestral homeland that Maori tradition identifies as Hawaii. The content of each basket in the Maori tradition, as recorded across multiple independent oral lineages that show considerable consistency, despite centuries of geographic separation among their custodians, corresponds to the 8-instruction framework of the restricted tablets, not only in the number and general domain of the transmissions, but in specific details about access restrictions. The 4th basket, associated in the Maori tradition with the domain of material transformation and the working of substances, is described in multiple lineages as being accessible only to those who have completed the preparatory training specified for the first 3 baskets, a sequential access requirement that precisely mirrors the interdependence between the 4 metallurgical tiers described in the restricted tablet's 4th instruction. The 6th of Enki's instructions addresses the organization of human political authority with a systematic thoroughness that reveals not a theology of divine right, but an operational framework for structuring human governance to maximize long-term civilizational stability across periods of ecological and astronomical stress. The restricted tablets describe the institution of kingship not as a political development, but as an administrative necessity created by Enki to solve a specific management problem. How to maintain the transmission of essential knowledge through human intermediaries across time periods that exceeded any individual human lifespan. The solution described in the 6th instruction is the establishment of what the tablets call the living archive, a royal lineage whose members receive not only political authority, but structured initiation into the knowledge domains covered by the 8 instructions, with each generation of rulers trained by a specialized priestly class specifically designated for this purpose. The governance principles in the 6th instruction include protocols for succession that prioritize knowledge transmission over bloodline continuity, a feature that distinguishes this material from conventional ancient kingship ideology and suggests its origin predates the political motivations that typically shaped royal religious literature. Tablet CBS 15047 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, a document from the early dynastic period that preserves fragments of administrative guidelines for royal education, includes passages that correspond closely to sections of the 6th instruction, particularly in their description of the 12-year training curriculum required for a king to be considered fully initiated in the administrative responsibilities of sacred rulership. The governance model described in the 6th instruction differs from every other ancient political philosophy in one respect that is both structurally fundamental and philosophically consequential. Where Mesopotamian royal ideology in its standard public formulation justified kingship through divine election and military prowess, and where the later philosophical traditions of Greece and Rome justified political authority through either natural hierarchy or social contract, the 6th instruction justifies the institution of kingship through a purely functional argument derived from the knowledge preservation requirements established in the other 7 instructions. The restricted tablets state this argument explicitly. The single most important function of a ruler in the governance framework the 6th instruction establishes is not military protection, not economic management, and not judicial administration, though the instruction addresses all 3 of these domains in practical detail. The single most important function is the custody of knowledge, specifically the custody of those domains of the 8 instructions that apply to long-term civilizational survival across the catastrophic cycles described in the 8th instruction. Every other governance responsibility is ranked below and subordinated to this custodial function, with the practical implication that a ruler who fails to maintain knowledge custody while excelling in all other domains of governance has failed at the primary responsibility of the office. The practical consequences of this knowledge custodial model of governance are visible in the archaeological and administrative record of the earliest Mesopotamian city-states in ways that conventional political history has not fully recognized. the intimate association between Mesopotamian rulers and the temple establishments that administered the restricted knowledge domains was not merely a political alliance between secular and religious authority of the type familiar from later historical periods. The administrative tablets from Lagash during the reign of Gudea, approximately 2140 before the Common Era, describe a relationship between the ruler and the temple scribal establishment that bears a closer resemblance to a structured educational curriculum than to a political partnership, with Gudea personally engaged in extended study of astronomical calculation methods, architectural proportion systems, and what the tablets describe as the ancient procedures of the divine house. The famous Gudea cylinders, discovered at Tello by Ernest de Sarzec beginning in 1881 and now preserved in the Louvre, describe Gudea receiving detailed architectural specifications for a new temple through a series of dreams interpreted by specialist priests, a process that the restricted tablet's sixth instruction describes as the standard protocol for transmitting technically complex construction knowledge from the priestly custodians of the archive to the ruling authority responsible for implementing it. The question of why specific knowledge would be classified as too dangerous for public priestly access becomes clearer when the structure of the Nippur temple administration is reconstructed from the administrative cuneiform record. Nippur occupied a unique position in Mesopotamian civilization as the religious capital whose temples held authority over the legitimacy of all Mesopotamian rulers regardless of political boundaries, a situation that invested the Nippur priesthood with power that derived specifically from their perceived guardianship of essential divine knowledge. The Nippur temple archives, comprising thousands of tablets recovered across multiple excavation campaigns and distributed between the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, and the Oriental Institute, document a priestly hierarchy of extraordinary complexity with distinct ranks, specialized training requirements, and carefully delineated knowledge access permissions. Tablets from the Ur-III period document at least 7 distinct ranks within the astronomer priest class alone, each rank defined not by administrative seniority, but by the level of astronomical and cosmological knowledge the priest had demonstrated competency in through formal examination. The highest rank, designated in the administrative texts as the one who keeps the foundation of heaven, appears in connection with the restricted tablet chamber, with procurement records showing that individuals holding this rank received special rations and housing allowances that far exceeded those of even senior temple administrators. The training curriculum that advanced a Nippur priest through the 7 astronomer ranks is partially reconstructible from administrative tablets that record examination requirements, training duration specifications, and the specific knowledge domains assessed at each advancement threshold. The first 3 ranks encompass knowledge available in the second tier of the general scribal classification system, covering standard astronomical observation methods, basic eclipse cycle calculations, and the operation of the conventional mathematical tools used in temple administrative work. The 4th rank required demonstrated competency in processional calculations extending across multiple centuries, a mathematical challenge that demanded not only theoretical understanding of the processional mechanism, but practical mastery of the interpolation techniques required to generate accurate positions for any point within the 25,920-year cycle from the baseline observations available to a working astronomer. The 5th rank required knowledge that the administrative texts describe only by its restricted designation the numbers of the deep cycles a phrase that specialists in Mesopotamian astronomical literature have associated with the longer period astronomical phenomena recorded in the Mulapin Compendium, including galactic scale cycles that extend well beyond anything observable within a single human lifetime or even within the institutional memory of any known ancient civilization. The 6th and 7th ranks of the Nippur astronomer-priest hierarchy are documented in the administrative record only through their access permissions and material support allowances, rather than through any description of their knowledge content, a notable absence that is itself informative. The deliberate withholding of content descriptions for the highest 2 priestly ranks from the administrative documentation that otherwise specified training requirements and examination criteria in considerable detail suggests that the knowledge associated with these ranks was considered too sensitive to commit to the relatively accessible administrative record. The only documents in the Nippur archive that explicitly reference the knowledge associated with the 6th and 7th astronomer ranks are the procurement records that specify the materials and facilities made available to their holders, records that list items including specific crystalline minerals, metallic compounds with unusual specifications, and what the procurement texts describe as instruments of the Great Reckoning, a designation that appears in no other administrative context and has no established scholarly interpretation. The connection between these procurement records for the highest-ranking astronomer priests at Nippur and the restricted tablets' descriptions of equipment used in the transmission of the 7th and 8th instructions suggests that the priestly hierarchy's upper tiers were specifically organized to maintain and deploy the most consequential components of Enki's knowledge framework, components whose operational requirements necessitated precisely the unusual materials and instruments that the procurement records document without explaining. The 7th instruction in the Nippur Restricted Series addresses the most philosophically consequential domain of all 8 transmissions and the one most clearly marked with the prohibition against public recitation. The tablets describe Enki's 7th instruction as knowledge concerning what the text calls the architecture of awareness, a detailed account of the structure of human consciousness, its relationship to the physical body, its behavior at the moment of physical death, and crucially, the specific procedures by which continuity of awareness could be maintained across the transition from embodied to disembodied existence. This material, occupying 17 tablets in the restricted collection and representing the second largest section of the series, presents a technical account of consciousness with a precision that places it in a category entirely separate from the afterlife mythology preserved in publicly accessible Mesopotamian religious literature. Where the standard Sumerian and Akkadian accounts of the underworld describe a shadowy realm of diminished existence governed by the goddess Ereshkigal, the 7th instruction describes a structured process by which trained individuals could maintain full cognitive continuity through physical death and deploy specific practices to influence their subsequent embodied existence. The Egyptian pyramid texts, inscribed in the burial chambers of Old Kingdom pharaohs, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas around 2300 before the Common Era, contain passages that correspond with remarkable precision to sections of the 7th instruction, a correspondence first identified by Egyptologist Erich Hornung of the University of Basel in his analysis of the pyramid texts' relationship to older Near Eastern theological material. The structural organization of the 7th instruction divides the architecture of awareness into 7 distinct components, a numerical parallel to the 7 biological modifications described in the 1st instruction that is almost certainly deliberate rather than coincidental. The tablets designate these components using a set of Sumerian terms whose precise translation has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, but whose functional descriptions within the text are sufficiently detailed to allow a reasonable reconstruction of the theoretical model they represent. The first component, designated by a term that translators have rendered variously as the luminous body, the field of knowing and the surrounding intelligence, appears to describe what the tablets identify as the aspect of human awareness that exists in direct relationship with the physical body, but is not itself physically constituted, a description whose functional content maps closely onto the concept of the bioelectric field that modern neuroscience identifies as the electromagnetic envelope generated by neural activity and extending several centimeters beyond the physical boundary of the brain. The restricted tablets describe this component not as a spiritual metaphor but as a measurable and manipulable phenomenon whose properties can be systematically altered through specific practices to produce predictable changes in perceptual capacity and cognitive function. The procedures described in the seventh instruction for maintaining awareness continuity through physical death are presented in the restricted tablets with the same operational precision that characterizes the medical prescriptions in the second instruction and the metallurgical formulations in the fourth. The tablets specify a sequence of preparatory practices that must begin years before the anticipated moment of death, including specific meditation techniques described in terms of posture, breathing rhythm, and attentional focus parameters that the text presents as producing measurable changes in the practitioner's relationship to the first three components of consciousness during ordinary waking life. These preparatory practices are described as creating what the tablets call the stable bridge, a conditioned pattern of awareness that persists through the dissolution of the physical body because it has been sufficiently established through sustained practice to operate independently of the neural substrate that normally supports it. The analogy the restricted tablets use for this process involves the behavior of water, noting that a channel cut deeply enough into solid stone will continue to direct water flow even when the surrounding earth has eroded away, an analogy whose physical accuracy provides indirect evidence that the author of this section of the tablets possessed a working model of neural plasticity sufficiently sophisticated to generate functionally correct analogies for the relationship between practiced mental patterns and the physical substrate in which they are instantiated. The correspondence between the seventh instruction's consciousness model and the Egyptian pyramid texts that Hornung identified in his 1979 analysis published by Cornell University Press extends well beyond the general concept of post-mortem awareness preservation into specific procedural details. The pyramid texts describe a sequence of transformations that the deceased ruler undergoes following physical death, employing a vocabulary of ascent, orientation, and identification with specific stellar regions that maps onto the seventh instruction's description of the stages through which a prepared consciousness navigates the post-mortem transition. The specific stellar coordinates given in the pyramid texts for the destinations of the royal consciousness correspond to positions in the Mul-Apin astronomical compendium that are identified in the restricted tablet's seventh instruction as the primary orientation markers for consciousness navigation after the dissolution of physical embodiment, a correspondence so technically specific that it demands explanation in terms either of direct textual borrowing between the two traditions or of common derivation from a shared antecedent source of the kind the restricted tablets themselves claim to represent. Given the Egyptian pyramid texts own internal claim to be preserving knowledge from a period before the establishment of Egyptian civilization as it was known in the Old Kingdom. The possibility of common derivation from antediluvian sources is more consistent with the available evidence than the alternative of direct borrowing between two traditions separated by geography, language, and political context. The reason the seventh instruction carried the most explicit prohibition against public recitation within the restricted series becomes apparent when the social and political implications of its content are considered. Knowledge that enables trained practitioners to maintain full cognitive continuity through physical death, to retain memories across successive embodiments, and to deliberately influence the conditions of subsequent physical existence, constitutes a form of personal power that would fundamentally alter the relationship between an individual practitioner and any political or institutional authority that derives its legitimacy from control over access to the divine. A practitioner who could demonstrate personal continuity across multiple lifetimes would possess an experiential authority grounded in direct knowledge that no institutional structure could match or challenge. The priestly hierarchy at Nippur, whose power depended on its exclusive mediation between the human community and the divine knowledge domains it custodied, had the most immediate institutional reason for ensuring that the seventh instruction never entered public discourse. The prohibition against recitation was not, on this interpretation, a safeguard against the misuse of dangerous knowledge. It was a protection of institutional authority against the most fundamental challenge that genuine spiritual knowledge could pose to any system of mediated religious power. The site of Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating to approximately 9600 before the Common Era and systematically excavated by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute beginning in 1995, represents the single most important piece of physical evidence for the existence of organized advanced knowledge systems in the period that the Nippur Restricted Series identifies as the time of Enki's instructions. The scale and sophistication of Gobekli Tepe is so far outside the expected capabilities of its supposed builders, hunter-gatherer populations without permanent settlements or agricultural food surpluses, that Schmidt himself described the site as challenging every established model of how civilizational complexity develops. The T-shaped limestone pillars at Gobekli Tepe, some reaching 5 meters in height and weighing between 10 and 20 tons, are decorated with carved reliefs of extraordinary technical sophistication that demonstrate mastery of stoneworking techniques requiring not improvised tools but precisely engineered cutting and abrasion instruments. The iconographic program of the carved reliefs includes representations of beings that differ from human figures in specific physical proportions, including extended cranial volumes and elongated arms that match descriptions of the Abgallu found in cuneiform texts associated with the Antediluvian knowledge transmission period. The astronomical alignments incorporated into Gobekli Tepe's circular enclosures, analysed by independent researcher Giulio Magli in a 2013 study published in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, demonstrate knowledge of stellar positions and processional movement that should not have been available to a non-literate pre-agricultural population. The logistical analysis of Gobekli Tepe's construction requirements provides the starkest illustration of the challenge the site poses to conventional models of prehistoric human capability. Geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, whose analysis of the site's geological context was published in 2012, calculated that the quarrying, transport and erection of the limestone pillars at Gobekli Tepe would have required the coordinated labour of a minimum of 500 individuals working in organised task-specific teams across an extended construction period. The organisation of this labour force required administrative coordination of a complexity that conventional archaeology associates exclusively with settled urban societies possessing hierarchical social structures, surplus food production systems capable of supporting a non-agricultural labour force, and communication systems enabling consistent direction of geographically distributed work parties. None of these prerequisites are supposed to have existed in southeastern Anatolia at 9600 before the Common Era, yet the physical evidence of their exercise at Gobekli Tepe is incontrovertible. The site does not merely suggest organised complexity, it requires it as a necessary condition of its own existence. The deliberate burial of Gobekli Tepe, which Schmidt's excavations confirmed was intentional rather than the result of natural sediment accumulation, adds a further layer of significance to the site's relationship with the restricted tablets account of pre-flood knowledge preservation. The burial, which appears to have been carried out in a single organised effort approximately 8,000 before the Common Era, sealed the site beneath several metres of carefully deposited fill material that preserved the carved pillars and enclosure structures in near-perfect condition. Schmidt's interpretation of the burial as an act of intentional preservation rather than abandonment is supported by the care with which the fill material was deposited, avoiding damage to the carved surfaces and maintaining the structural integrity of the enclosures beneath the accumulated material. The restricted tablet's 9th instruction sequence describes precisely this kind of deliberate burial of knowledge-bearing structures as one component of the pre-flood preservation strategy that Enki organised, specifying that certain sites were to be sealed and buried according to procedures that would allow future civilizations to locate and excavate them when the time was appropriate for the preserved knowledge to be recovered. The precision with which Gobekli Tepe's burial matches this description is among the most striking single correspondences between the restricted tablet's narrative and the physical archaeological record. The carved iconography on Gobekli Tepe's pillars provides a further level of correspondence with the restricted tablets that extends beyond the general physical description of Abgallu-like figures into specific symbolic content that parallels elements of the 8 instruction framework. Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, designated by researchers as the Vulture Stone, and documented in detail by Schmidt's team in excavation reports from 2006, displays a complex scene in which a vulture supports what appears to be a circular disc above its wing, while below, a headless human figure lies surrounded by animals associated in multiple ancient traditions with the boundary between life and death. The interpretive framework provided by the 7th instruction's account of post-mortem consciousness navigation illuminates this iconographic program with a precision that purely mythological interpretation cannot match, identifying the circular disc as a representation of the luminous body component of consciousness, described in the 7th instruction, the vulture as the carrier of awareness across the threshold of physical death, and the headless human figure as the body abandoned by consciousness during the transition process. Whether or not this interpretation is correct in every detail, its internal consistency with the 7th instruction's technical model suggests that Gobekli Tepe's builders possessed knowledge from the same tradition that the restricted tablets preserve, a tradition whose physical expression in stone predates the Nippur tablet's clay encoding by more than 6,000 years. The 8th and final instruction in the Nippur Restricted Series addresses the domain that provides the interpretive framework for understanding why all of the preceding 7 instructions exist and why they were transmitted in the specific manner the restricted tablets describe. The 8th instruction concerns what the tablets identify as the knowledge of the great cycles, a structured account of the recurring astronomical and geological catastrophes that periodically destroy advanced civilizations, reducing human populations to survival-level existence and forcing a complete reconstruction of accumulated knowledge from whatever fragments survive. The tablets present this knowledge not as prophecy but as observed historical fact, describing specific mechanisms of planetary and astronomical disruption that the Cuneiform text indicates Enki's council had personally witnessed across multiple previous cycles of human civilizational development. The mathematical precision with which the 8th instruction describes these cycles provides one of the most verifiable aspects of the entire restricted series, because the temporal periods enumerated in the tablets correspond with remarkable accuracy to periods of identified catastrophic disruption in the geological and astronomical record. The primary cycle described in the 8th instruction is identified as 3,600 years in duration, a period that the tablets designate as 1 Shah of the Great Year and describe as the interval at which the solar system's relationship to external astronomical forces creates conditions of maximum instability for terrestrial life. The mathematical derivation of the 3,600-year primary cycle is explained in the 8th instruction through a relationship to the precessional cycle, described in the 3rd instruction, a connection that reveals the integrated design of the 8 instruction framework at its deepest level. The restricted tablets state that the primary catastrophe cycle equals the precessional cycle of 25,920 years divided by the sacred divisor of 7.2, producing a result that the tablets express as exactly 3,600 years. The choice of 7.2 as the divisor is not arbitrary. In the base 60 mathematical framework of the 3rd instruction, 7.2 represents 1/8 of 60, and 60 itself represents 1/432nd of the precessional cycle, expressed in years. The nested mathematical relationships between these numbers, embedding the catastrophe cycle within the precessional cycle through the same base 60 encoding framework that governs all other calculations in the 8 instruction system, provides the strongest single piece of internal evidence that the 8 instructions were designed as components of a unified intellectual architecture, rather than assembled from diverse independent sources. The specific mechanisms of catastrophic disruption described in the 8th instruction encompass 3 distinct categories of event that the tablets present as often occurring in cascade sequences triggered by a single initiating cause. The first category, designated in the restricted tablets as the fire from the outer darkness, describes the entry of a large extraterrestrial body or dense debris field into the inner solar system, producing impact events, atmospheric loading, and electromagnetic disturbances capable of simultaneously destroying surface infrastructure across continental scales. The second category, designated as the rising of the deep waters, describes the geologically rapid redistribution of ocean mass resulting from ice sheet destabilization, polar ice collapse, or submarine seismic activity triggered by the initial impact events. The third category, designated as the shaking of the foundations, describes tectonic and volcanic responses to the combined gravitational, electromagnetic and thermal stresses generated by the first 2 categories of event. The tablets are explicit that these 3 categories rarely occur in isolation, describing the relationship between them as a cascade in which any first category event of sufficient magnitude will reliably trigger second and third category responses within a time window measured in decades rather than centuries. The historical record embedded in the Eighth Instruction's account of past cycles includes specific descriptions of previous catastrophic events that the tablets present as episodes personally documented by members of Enki's council across multiple preceding civilizational cycles. The most recent of these documented episodes, described in the tablets as the Great Burning followed by the waters of the ending of the Third Age, corresponds in its described characteristics to the Younger Dryas boundary event of approximately 12,900 years ago, with a specificity that extends to the sequence of phenomena, the hemispheric asymmetry of the worst effects, and the estimated duration of the recovery period during which human populations were reduced to subsistence-level survival. The tablet's description of conditions during this recovery period includes details about the astronomical configuration observable during the event's most severe phase, details that modern computational astronomy can test against calculated sky positions for 12,900 years before the Common Era, and that prove accurate within the observational precision that naked-eye astronomy could achieve. The geological and atmospheric record preserved in ice cores, ocean sediments, and terrestrial impact deposits provides the most direct modern validation of the catastrophic cycle knowledge that the Eighth Instruction describes. The Younger Dryas event, a period of abrupt and severe climate reversal that began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted for approximately 1,200 years before ending nearly as abruptly as it began, represents precisely the type of rapid civilizational reset that the Eighth Instruction identifies as the mechanism by which advanced human knowledge must be deliberately preserved rather than casually transmitted. Ice core data recovered from the Greenland GISP-2 and GRIP drilling projects, analysed by Richard Alley of Penn State University and his collaborators in research published between 1993 and 2003, reveals that the onset of the Younger Dryas involved temperature drops of up to 15 degrees Celsius in some northern regions within periods as short as a single decade. The GISP-2 core shows at the Younger Dryas boundary a distinctive chemical signature, including elevated concentrations of platinum, iridium, nanodiamonds, and spherular carbon particles, that a research team led by James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara identified in 2007 as consistent with a cosmic impact or airburst event of continental scale. The Eighth Instruction's description of fire from the sky that precedes the Great Waters corresponds with notable specificity to the sequence of events that modern science is reconstructing for the Younger Dryas boundary, including the impact-generated wildfires, atmospheric dust loading, and subsequent flooding from destabilized ice sheets that the geological record documents. The platinum anomaly at the Younger Dryas boundary deserves particular attention in this context because it is among the most geographically widespread and chemically specific of the impact markers identified in sediment records from the period. Platinum is a siderophile element, meaning it preferentially bonds with iron and consequently concentrates in planetary cores rather than crusts. Its rarity in terrestrial surface deposits makes its presence in elevated concentrations at a specific stratigraphic horizon, a highly specific indicator of extraterrestrial input, since the only mechanisms capable of introducing platinum to surface sediment layers in significant quantities are cosmic impact events and associated fallout from impact vaporized extraterrestrial material. The Younger Dryas boundary platinum anomaly has been detected at sites across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, a geographic distribution that the 8th instruction's description of a catastrophe affecting the entire known world simultaneously is consistent with, but that a regional impact event would not produce. Researcher Christopher Moore of the University of South Carolina, whose 2017 study published in the Journal of Geology documented platinum anomalies at 23 sites across the Northern Hemisphere, identified a concentration pattern in the boundary layer that suggests the impacting body fragmented before atmospheric entry and delivered its energy across a broad geographic footprint, precisely the scenario described in the 8th instruction's account of fire falling from many directions rather than from a single point in the sky. The nanodiamond evidence from the Younger Dryas boundary provides an additional layer of confirmation for the impact hypothesis, whose specificity goes beyond what conventional volcanic or climatic mechanisms can explain. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamond crystals ranging from 2 to 300 nanometers in diameter, form only under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature that occur naturally in planetary interiors or during high-velocity cosmic impact events. Their presence in Younger Dryas boundary sediments at multiple sites, documented by Alan West and colleagues in a 2007 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, requires an explanation involving either impact-generated shock waves propagating through surface sediments or the deposition of nanodiamonds formed within the impacting body itself, both scenarios consistent with the cosmic impact hypothesis. The Restricted Tablet's 8th instruction describes the fire from the outer darkness as carrying within it the seeds of a hardness greater than any stone known on Earth, a description that could plausibly represent an ancient account of the nanodiamond material present in carbonaceous chondrite meteorites. Expressed in the descriptive vocabulary available to observers who lacked the microscopic analysis tools needed to characterize the material precisely, but who possessed sufficiently detailed observational records to note its distinctive physical properties. The Younger Dryas impact's proposed mechanism, involving a fragmented cometary body entering Earth's atmosphere at a low angle and delivering energy across continental scales through airbursts rather than ground impacts, also explains the absence of large individual impact craters at the Younger Dryas boundary, an absence that skeptics of the impact hypothesis have cited as evidence against it. The 8th instruction addresses this specific point directly, describing the fire from the outer darkness as coming in a rain of smaller pieces rather than a single great stone, producing destruction through heat and wind rather than through the shaking of the earth that characterizes ground impacts. This distinction between airburst-dominated and impact-dominated cosmic bombardment events reflects a physical understanding of atmospheric entry dynamics that modern planetary science has developed only through computational modeling of large bodies traversing planetary atmospheres, modeling that was not available to any scientific tradition until the late 20th century. The Restricted Tablet's accurate representation of this distinction, presented as the experiential observation of beings who had witnessed the event's effects across multiple geographic regions, suggests either that the knowledge encoded in the 8th instruction derived from direct observation, or that whoever compiled it possessed a theoretical understanding of atmospheric physics sophisticated enough to generate accurate predictions about the phenomenology of airburst-dominated bombardment events. The archaeological record at Nippur preserves what may be direct physical evidence of a specific historical incident in which the prohibition against public recitation of the restricted tablets was violated, with consequences severe enough to leave their mark in both the material record and the cuneiform administrative documents of the period. a series of tablets recovered from the Nippur temple archives and dated through stratigraphic analysis to approximately 1900, before the Common Era described disciplinary proceedings against a senior temple official identified by the title Lunar, meaning the one who guards the night sky, whose specific offence the administrative tablets describe in terms that correspond precisely to the prohibition language appearing in the Restricted Series. The individual, identified only by the administrative title rather than by personal name in accordance with Mesopotamian practice for documenting serious priestly misconduct, is recorded as having recited before the assembly passages from what the disciplinary tablets call the hidden things of Enki's house, a designation that scholars of the Nippur priestly tradition have long associated with the third-tier restricted knowledge classification. The consequences recorded in the administrative documents are extraordinary for their severity. The lunar official was stripped of all priestly privileges. His family was removed from the hereditary priestly lists that governed access to temple employment, and a physical destruction of records associated with his tenure was ordered, explaining why certain sections of the Nippur astronomical records from this period show evidence of deliberate damage rather than accidental deterioration. The disciplinary proceedings preserved in the administrative tablets from this incident provide an unusually detailed window into the institutional mechanisms through which the prohibition on public recitation was enforced at Nippur. The tablets describing the case against the lunar official, catalogued under Penn Museum designations CBS 21412 through CBS 21419, constitute the longest disciplinary record in the Nippur archive collection, and were apparently maintained as a formal precedent document rather than simply as administrative history. This documentary status, indicated by the preservation formula appearing on the final tablet of the series, suggests that the priesthood considered this case important enough to maintain as an active reference for future disciplinary proceedings involving similar offences, an assessment that implies comparable incidents had occurred or were anticipated to occur again. The formal preservation of the case record also provided later temple administrators with a detailed procedural template for responding to violations of the restricted knowledge protocols, a template whose existence implies that the institutional management of these protocols was considered important enough to justify maintaining a formal body of precedent documentation. The specific passages that the lunar official is recorded as having recited publicly are not reproduced in the disciplinary tablets, consistent with the very restrictions the proceedings were intended to enforce. However, the disciplinary record describes the reaction of the assembly to the recitation in terms that provide indirect information about the content's nature. The tablets record that members of the assembly who heard the recitation experienced what the text describes as the opening of the inner sight without preparation, producing in several individuals states that the disciplinary record characterizes using terms associated with overwhelming perceptual disruption rather than spiritual enlightenment. 3 individuals are recorded as requiring extended care by the temple medical staff following the incident, and the administrative record notes that one senior priest who'd been present never returned to active temple duties. This account, whatever its ultimate interpretation, describes the public recitation of the hidden things of Enki's house as producing measurable physiological and psychological effects on unprepared listeners, effects severe enough to require medical intervention and to end at least one individual's professional career. The consistency of this account with the restricted tablet's own warnings about the consequences of deploying the 7th instruction's consciousness procedures without the preparatory framework specified in the preceding 6 instructions provides one of the most internally coherent confirmations in the entire Nippur documentary record that the restricted series contained material whose effects on human awareness were considered practically, rather than merely symbolically, dangerous. The Cuneiform record preserves an extended tradition of conflict between Enki and Enlil that conventional scholarship treats as theological mythology, representing competing natural forces, with Enki governing water and wisdom while Enlil governs wind and storm. A close reading of the administrative and literary texts that document this conflict, however, reveals something far more specific and more consequential than elemental mythology. The Enki-Enlil conflict, as documented in texts spanning from the early dynastic period through the Neo-Babylonian era, consistently centers on a single substantive disagreement. How much knowledge should be transmitted to humanity, through what channels, under what restrictions, and with what safeguards against misuse? The most explicit treatment of this disagreement appears in the text known as the Myth of the Pickaxe, a composition preserved in multiple tablet copies from the Nippur scribal tradition, where Enlil's decision to create humanity using the most restrictive possible knowledge framework is explicitly contrasted with Enki's argument for a more comprehensive transmission. The restricted tablets from the Nippur series cast this conflict in terms that clarify its stakes considerably. Enki's position, as articulated in an extended passage in the tablet sequence preceding the first instruction, is that the knowledge he intends to transmit is not a gift to humanity, but a survival insurance system, an intentional counterbalance against the certainty of future catastrophes that Enlil's more restrictive administration fails to account for with adequate long-term planning. The administrative and literary evidence for the Enki-Enlil disagreement spans a chronological range of more than 2,000 years, and appears across enough independent source traditions to establish it as a genuine and persistent institutional conflict, rather than a literary device invented by a single scribal school for narrative convenience. The Sumerian composition known as Enki and Ninmah, preserved in copies from the Old Babylonian period, describes a contest between Enki and Ninmah in which Enki successfully finds roles for beings with various physical limitations, demonstrating his commitment to the principle that no form of humanity, however imperfect relative to the original biological template, should be excluded from meaningful participation in the civilizational project. This principle, which the restricted tablets identify as foundational to the first instructions approach to human biological design, stands in direct contrast to Enlil's repeated insistence throughout the Cuneiform record that humanity should be managed through restriction and selective elimination of those who threaten the established order, a position whose most extreme expression is Enlil's decision to send the flood as a solution to the problem of human overpopulation, a noise described in the Atrahasis epic. The Myth of the Pickaxe, catalogued as Tablet CBS 13,391 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and dating to the early Old Babylonian period, but clearly drawing from earlier Sumerian sources, contains a passage that the restricted tablet's commentary section explicitly cross-references as a distorted public account of the actual policy debate that preceded the first instructions transmission. The standard version of the Myth of the Pickaxe describes Enlil using his divine tool to split open the earth and release humanity from within it, an act presented as Enlil's creative contribution to the civilizational project. The restricted tablet's commentary identifies this narrative as an institutional revision of events in which Enlil's actual role was not creative but restrictive, specifying the limits on human cognitive capability and lifespan that Enki's transmission of the first instruction was specifically designed to counter. This claim, which cannot be independently verified from the cuneiform record as it stands, is consistent with the pattern of deliberate incompleteness and selective presentation of information that the restricted tablets identify throughout the standard public Mesopotamian literary tradition, a pattern whose most documented example is the truncated version of the Eridu Genesis discussed in the context of the ninth sequence. The political dimension of the Enki-Enlil conflict provides essential context for understanding why the restricted tablets existed at all and why they required the protection of the Nislibi classification rather than simply remaining unwritten. Enlil's administrative philosophy, as reconstructable from the cuneiform record, consistently favoured the concentration of essential knowledge within the smallest possible group of authorised custodians, a policy whose institutional expression was the Nippur temple hierarchy itself. Enki's counter-philosophy, as expressed in the restricted tablets' prefatory material, argued that catastrophic cycles made this concentration strategy fundamentally inadequate as a long-term survival mechanism, because any sufficiently severe catastrophe would eliminate the concentrated custodians along with the knowledge they held exclusively. The 8 instructions represent Enki's practical implementation of his alternative strategy, distributing essential knowledge more broadly through a structured transmission system, designed to ensure that even a civilization reduced to small scattered survivor groups would retain access to sufficient knowledge to rebuild advanced capabilities within a recoverable time frame. The restricted tablets thus occupy a paradoxical position within the Nippur institutional framework as documents that embody a knowledge philosophy fundamentally at odds with the institutional structure that preserved and protected them. The 8th instruction's concern with preserving knowledge across catastrophic cycles implies a physical preservation strategy, and the archaeological record both above and below modern sea levels provides evidence that such a strategy was implemented with considerable geographical scope. The Persian Gulf, currently one of the world's shallowest seas with an average depth of approximately 35 meters, was completely exposed as a river valley during the last glacial maximum approximately 20,000 years ago, creating a fertile lowland fed by the combined drainage of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun and Wadi Batin rivers. The gradual flooding of this valley as global sea levels rose following the end of the Ice Age, a process that would have proceeded over several thousand years and would have been within living memory across multiple human generations, corresponds with flood traditions preserved throughout the ancient Near East, and provides a plausible physical mechanism for the Great Inundation described in the earliest Mesopotamian literature. Marine geological surveys of the Persian Gulf seafloor, conducted by teams from Kuwait University and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution between 2000 and 2012, identified river channel features, buried soil horizons, and what appear to be structural formations consistent with human construction at depths corresponding to sea levels from approximately 8,000 years before the Common Era. The structural formations detected through sub-bottom profiling sonar and described in a 2012 paper in the journal Quaternary International by researcher Jeffrey Rose include rectilinear features at 3 sites in the southern Gulf that show the geometric regularity characteristic of deliberate architectural construction rather than natural geological formation. Rose's analysis of the sub-bottom sonar data identified the 3 anomalous sites at depths ranging from 15 to 28 meters below current sea level, placing them in water that would have been dry land between approximately 10,000 and 7,000 years before the Common Era based on the established post-glacial sea level rise curve for the Persian Gulf region. The rectilinear features at each site share a consistent internal organization that Rose's paper describes as showing spatial relationships between individual elements, consistent with planned urban layout rather than random structural distribution. The largest of the three sites, located approximately 80 kilometers northeast of the Qatar Peninsula, shows a rectilinear arrangement of features extending over an area of approximately 2 square kilometers, a spatial scale that, if the features represent actual structural remains, would indicate a settlement of considerable size by the standards of the proposed occupation period. The physical dimensions of the individual rectilinear elements at this site, where the sonar resolution is sufficient to allow approximate measurement, correspond to building footprints in the range of 10 to 20 meters on a side, dimensions consistent with substantial permanent construction rather than temporary or lightweight structures. The significance of the Persian Gulf site evidence for the restricted tablets knowledge preservation narrative is amplified by the geographical relationship between the submerged sites and the locations identified in the tablets as primary archive stations for the pre-flood knowledge repositories. The ninth sequence's description of the primary archive station as located in the southern river valley, where the great waters first recede after the flood, places the central knowledge repository in a region that the restricted tablet's own geographical framework would position squarely within the area now covered by the Persian Gulf. If the 8 instructions were transmitted and initially encoded during a period when the Persian Gulf basin was a fertile river valley supporting an advanced civilization, then the physical repositories of that knowledge would have been submerged as sea levels rose following the Younger Dryas boundary event, explaining why the tradition describes the knowledge as surviving the flood in portable sealed transmissions carried by individual custodians rather than as a fixed library that could be returned to intact. The restricted tablet's emphasis on human carriers of knowledge, the Abgallu tradition, the training of selected human pupils, and the establishment of hereditary priestly lineages to maintain knowledge transmission, takes on practical rather than merely pedagogical significance when understood against this background of a primary archive permanently lost beneath rising waters. The underwater archaeology of the Yonaguni monument off the coast of Japan, whose precisely cut stone terraces and geometric platform arrangements at depths of between 5 and 25 meters below current sea level, have been studied by researchers including Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus since the site's discovery in 1986, provides a parallel case of submerged architectural evidence at the opposite end of the Eurasian continent. Kimura's analysis of the Yonaguni structure's geometric features, published in the journal Science and Culture in 2004, identified right-angle intersections, parallel surfaces, and a system of what appear to be deliberately cut channels and staircase-like features, whose combination of characteristics Kimura argued exceeds the probability threshold for natural formation through any known geological process. The Yonaguni site's submersion timeline, derived from the regional sea level rise curve for the East China Sea, places its above-water period in the same broad timeframe as the Persian Gulf sites, between approximately 10,000 and 8,000 years before the Common Era, a period corresponding to the later phases of the Younger Dryas boundary event and its immediate aftermath. The simultaneous presence of apparently artificial submerged structures at opposite ends of the ancient world's most densely populated landmass provides physical support for the restricted tablet's claim that the pre-flood knowledge preservation effort encompassed a geographically distributed network of sites rather than a single centralized location. The Bronze Age collapse, that catastrophic simultaneous failure of nearly every advanced civilization in the eastern Mediterranean between approximately 1200 and 1150 before the Common Era, represents the most dramatic civilizational reset in recorded history and provides the most severe test case for the knowledge preservation systems that the Nippur Restricted Series describes as essential for surviving cyclical catastrophes. Within a period of approximately 50 years, the Mycenaean Greek palace civilization, the Hittite Empire, the Ugaritic city-state, the Cypriot urban culture, and significant portions of the Egyptian New Kingdom administrative apparatus all collapsed simultaneously, with the physical destruction of palace complexes, the abandonment of major urban centres, and the disappearance of writing systems in Greece and Anatolia, representing losses of accumulated knowledge on a scale unparalleled in the documented historical record. What makes the Bronze Age collapse particularly relevant to the restricted tablets is that it occurred at a point in time that corresponds closely with one of the shorter subcycle intervals described in the 8th instruction, the 600-year period that the tablets designate as a time of the turning gates. The survival of specific knowledge streams through this catastrophe, including the astronomical calculation methods that reappear in early first millennium Babylonian astronomy, with a sophistication that cannot be explained by independent reinvention, provides evidence that institutionalized knowledge preservation systems of the type described in the restricted tablets were operating effectively during one of history's most severe civilizational disruptions. The Bronze Age collapse's cause remains one of the most intensely debated questions in ancient history, with proposed explanations including climate change, drought, systems collapse driven by the disruption of long-distance trade networks, internal social upheaval, and external invasion by the Sea Peoples documented in Egyptian New Kingdom records. Brandon Drake of the University of New Mexico published analysis in 2012 in the Journal of Archaeological Science, demonstrating through oxygen isotope data from marine sediment cores that a prolonged drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean between approximately 1200 and 1150, before the Common Era was severe enough to have simultaneously stressed the agricultural systems of every major civilization in the region. Eric Klein of George Washington University, whose 2014 synthesis of Bronze Age collapse evidence argues for a systems collapse model driven by the simultaneous failure of multiple interdependent systems, identifies the convergence of drought, disrupted trade, internal unrest and external military pressure as producing a cascade failure that no individual civilization possessed the institutional resilience to survive. The restricted tablet's 8th instruction identifies precisely this kind of multi-factor simultaneous stress as the characteristic signature of sub-cycle turning gate events, describing them as periods when several of the cascade mechanisms described in the primary cycle interact without producing the full-scale catastrophic reset that a primary cycle event would trigger, but generating sufficient simultaneous disruption to collapse civilizational systems that are not designed with adequate redundancy and preservation protocols. The knowledge that did survive the Bronze Age collapse and reappeared in the early first millennium Babylonian astronomical tradition represents the most traceable example of restricted knowledge transmission operating across a civilizational reset event. The astronomical calculation methods preserved in the Mul-Apin Compendium, whose earliest copies date to approximately 1100 before the Common Era, but which contain observational data from substantially earlier periods, demonstrate a continuity of mathematical sophistication through the Bronze Age collapse that cannot be explained by independent reconstruction from basic astronomical observation during the Dark Age period. The specific numerical parameters used in Mul-Apini's eclipse prediction algorithms, including the Saros cycle of 223 lunations and the ex-ligmos triple saros of 669 lunations correspond precisely to parameters that appear in late Bronze Age astronomical texts from Ugarit, suggesting that the destruction of Ugarit around 1285 before the Common Era did not eliminate the astronomical knowledge that the Ugaritic scribal tradition had maintained, but rather that this knowledge was carried through the catastrophe by human custodians, who reconstituted it in the early Neo-Assyrian astronomical tradition within 2 or 3 generations of the collapse. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered in 1901 from a Roman shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera by sponge divers working under the direction of archaeological inspector Spiridon Stays, stands as the most physically concrete evidence for the existence of advanced technical knowledge traditions that operated in the ancient world without leaving continuous archaeological traces of their development. The device, now dated through inscriptional analysis to approximately 100 before the Common Era, consists of at least 37 interlocking bronze gears arranged to calculate astronomical positions, eclipse cycles, and Panhellenic festival dates with an accuracy that required its designers to possess knowledge of differential gearing, epicyclic mechanisms, and complex astronomical mathematics that were not officially reinvented in Western technology until the 14th and 16th centuries of the Common Era respectively. The construction analysis conducted by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, a consortium including researchers from Cardiff University, the National Archaeological Museum of Athens and Hewlett-Packard, using 3-dimensional X-ray computed tomography, completed between 2005 and 2008, revealed gear tooth profiles and wheel train architectures that demonstrate not the crude approximations of an early experimental technology, but the refined precision of a fully mature engineering tradition. The gap of more than 1,000 years between the Antikythera mechanism and the next documented appearance of comparable mechanical complexity in European technology is precisely the kind of discontinuity that the restricted tablets knowledge preservation narrative predicts. Advanced technical knowledge periodically disappears from the mainstream archaeological record, not because it was forgotten, but because the institutions that maintained it were deliberately concealed. The gear train architecture of the Antikythera mechanism incorporates the specific mathematical relationships embedded in the third instruction's base 60 encoding framework at every level of its design. The main drive wheel contains 223 teeth, corresponding to the Saros eclipse cycle measured in lunations, a number that in the base 60 system equals 3 saroi of the standard Mesopotamian time unit. The subsidiary gear for tracking the anomalistic month, the period between successive lunar perigees, contains 127 teeth, a number that combined with the main wheel's tooth count generates the correct ratio for the anomalistic month to within an accuracy of approximately 1 part in 40,000. The mathematical precision required to identify these tooth counts as optimal for their respective astronomical calculations requires knowledge of the astronomical periods to be represented at a level of decimal precision, substantially exceeding the accuracy achievable through naked eye observation, indicating that the mechanism's designers were working from a pre-existing database of astronomical constants rather than deriving the required tooth counts from their own observational records. The bronze alloy composition of the Antikythera mechanism's gears, analysed by researchers from the National Technical University of Athens using X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, and published in a 2008 study, reveals a copper-to-tin ratio of approximately 95:5, with trace elements present in a profile that differs from standard ancient Greek bronze production. The trace element signature includes small concentrations of elements whose presence in this specific combination cannot be explained by the ore sources available within the standard ancient Greek trade network. The metallurgical profile of the mechanism's bronze corresponds more closely to the enhanced alloy formulations described in the fourth instruction's restricted tier than to ordinary commercial bronze production of the Hellenistic period, suggesting that the mechanism was produced not in a standard craftsman's workshop but in a restricted production environment with access to fourth-tier metallurgical knowledge of the type that the Nippur Restricted Series identifies as not for the hands of the marketplace. The mechanism thus provides, in a single physical object, simultaneous evidence for the survival of restricted astronomical knowledge from the third instruction, and restricted metallurgical knowledge from the fourth instruction operating in combination within a single production tradition, precisely the kind of integrated deployment of multiple knowledge domains that the 8-instruction framework was designed to make possible. As the accumulated evidence from multiple independent domains converges on a single conclusion, the scale of what the Nippur Restricted Series represents for our understanding of human history becomes both intellectually transformative and practically urgent. The tablets do not describe mythology. They do not preserve the religious imagination of a pre-scientific culture, projecting human social structures onto natural forces. They describe a structured knowledge transmission delivered by an advanced intelligence to a developing human civilization during a period of geological and astronomical instability, encoded in physical clay with deliberate restrictions on its dissemination, and preserved through institutional channels sophisticated enough to maintain their function across 4,000 years of political change and cultural disruption. The evidence for the genuine antiquity of this knowledge, from the archaic linguistic features identified by Miguel Civil to the metallurgical formulations confirmed by modern materials analysis, from the astronomical constants encoded in the base 60 mathematical system to the pharmacological compound protocols that anticipate modern biochemistry by millennia, cannot be adequately explained by any model of ancient knowledge development that does not account for access to information substantially more advanced than what human civilization had independently achieved. The 8 instructions, taken together, represent a complete survival system for human civilization, addressing the biological template of human capability, the medical knowledge necessary for maintaining physical health across extended periods, the mathematical framework required for tracking catastrophic cycles, the metallurgical knowledge enabling rapid technological reconstruction, the agricultural science sustaining populations through disrupted growing seasons, the governance principles maintaining social cohesion under existential stress, the consciousness knowledge enabling continuity of critical awareness across civilizational resets, and the catastrophe cycle data, providing the long-term temporal framework within which all other knowledge becomes meaningful. The pattern of evidence across these 8 domains reveals a coherence that cannot be attributed to coincidence or to the selective confirmation bias of researchers seeking correspondences between ancient texts and modern science. The mathematical relationships between the 8 instruction domains, each referencing and depending upon the encoding frameworks established in adjacent domains, demonstrate a systemic integration of knowledge whose complexity exceeds any single intellectual tradition's capacity for independent invention. The pharmacological prescriptions of the second instruction require the mathematical notation established in the third instruction for their specification. The agricultural management protocols of the fifth instruction require the calendar calculation methods derived from the third instruction's astronomical encoding for their timing requirements. The governance succession protocols of the sixth instruction require the catastrophe cycle chronology of the eighth instruction for the temporal framework within which knowledge custodial responsibilities are assigned. Remove any single instruction from the framework and the practical utility of the remaining 7 is substantially diminished. This interdependence is not the characteristic of knowledge that accumulated gradually through independent practical experience in different domains. It is the characteristic of knowledge that was designed as an integrated system by an intelligence that understood all 8 domains simultaneously and built the dependencies between them deliberately to ensure that the framework would only be fully functional when transmitted and received in its complete form. The question of who the priests were forbidden to read these tablets aloud to resolves into a more fundamental question about the nature of the prohibiting authority itself. The Nislibi classification was not imposed by a human institution acting on its own judgment about what knowledge was too dangerous for general access. According to the restricted tablet's own prefatory material, the prohibition was established by the same authority that transmitted the knowledge, by Enki himself, through the Abgallu transmission system as a condition of the knowledge's delivery rather than as an afterthought added by cautious human custodians. The rationale stated in the restricted tablets for the prohibition is not the protection of institutional power, though that became the operational motivation for subsequent human custodians. The rationale stated in the text itself is temporal, describing the prohibition as appropriate for the current phase of civilizational development, but explicitly designated as time-limited, to be lifted when humanity achieves what the tablets describe as the capacity to receive without being overwhelmed, a condition the text associates with specific developments in both technological capability and collective wisdom, whose convergence the eighth instruction's cyclical framework places at a specific point in the processional timeline, the precision of the 8 instructions' internal cross-referencing, the consistency of their technical content with modern scientific understanding across domains as diverse as pharmacology, plant genetics, materials science, atmospheric physics, and consciousness research, and the convergence of independent archaeological evidence from submerged sites, buried monuments, and cross-cultural textual traditions on the same narrative of advanced pre-flood knowledge transmission, collectively constitute a body of evidence that the conventional archaeological framework has not found adequate explanatory models to address. The institutional response, represented by the Oriental Institute's cautious handling of the Nippur Restricted Series since 1953, reflects not scholarly dismissiveness but genuine uncertainty about how to integrate material of this nature into a professional discourse structured around assumptions about the linear development of human capability that this evidence directly challenges. The more urgent question for contemporary civilization is not why the knowledge was restricted then, but what it means that we are only now, at this precise moment in the processional cycle, uncovering the physical evidence that the 8th instruction predicted we would need. The convergence of the restricted tablet's catastrophe cycle chronology with the current moment in the 25,920-year processional framework, combined with the simultaneous emergence of global environmental stresses, technological disruption, and civilizational instability that the 8th instruction identifies as the characteristic signature of an approaching turning gate period, suggests that the question of what these tablets actually contain and what their complete transmission would make available to human civilization is not an academic question. it is the most practically consequential question that the evidence of the ancient world currently places before us. The investigation that began beneath the Ekur temple foundations at Nippur in 1953 has led through terrain that conventional archaeology was not designed to navigate. From the archaic grammatical structures that Miguel Civil's analysis placed in the late Ubaid period, through the pharmacological synergies that anticipate modern biochemistry by thousands of years, through the mathematical encoding of processional constants in a numerical system supposedly invented for administrative convenience, through the agricultural genetics that produced domesticated crop varieties too rapidly for undirected natural selection to account for, and through the consciousness architecture whose procedural precision finds its closest parallel in the most restricted chambers of the Egyptian Old Kingdom funerary tradition, the evidence has accumulated not as a collection of isolated anomalies, but as a coherent portrait of a knowledge system whose sophistication, whose internal integration, and whose explicit awareness of its own vulnerability to civilizational catastrophe place it entirely outside the explanatory frameworks that the standard history of human intellectual development provides. The 8 instructions are not 8 separate pieces of wisdom assembled by a culture reflecting on its accumulated experience. They are 8 interdependent components of a survival architecture whose designer understood that human civilization operates within astronomical and geological cycles far longer than any single civilization's institutional memory, and that the knowledge necessary for surviving the transitions between cycles must be encoded, restricted, preserved, and transmitted with the same systematic deliberateness that the instructions themselves describe. The Younger Dryas boundary event at 12,900 years ago, the Bronze Age collapse at approximately 1200 before the Common Era, and the cyclical subcycle markers that the 8th instruction identifies at 600-year intervals through the processional framework, all appear in the geological and historical record at positions that the restricted tablet's mathematical framework predicts with an accuracy that demands explanation in terms of genuine foreknowledge rather than retrospective pattern finding. The institutions through which the 8 instructions survive these cycles, from the Abgallu transmission system of the Antediluvian period, through the Nippur astronomer-priest hierarchy of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, through the mystery school traditions that carried mathematical and astronomical knowledge through the Bronze Age collapse, constitute a preservation effort whose multimillennial duration is itself one of the most remarkable achievements documented in the human record. That this effort was partly successful is demonstrated by the survival of the restricted tablets themselves. That it was only partly successful is demonstrated by the condition in which they were found, sealed beneath a temple complex whose active priestly tradition had long since lost the living context within which the instructions' full implications could be understood and deployed. What the Nippur Restricted Series ultimately presents to contemporary civilization is not simply a reinterpretation of ancient Mesopotamian religious literature. It presents a challenge to the foundational assumption that underlies every standard model of human history, the assumption that knowledge only moves forward, that what we know now is more than what any previous civilization knew, and that the most advanced intelligence ever applied to the problems of human survival is the intelligence currently being applied to them. The tablets argue, with the specificity of a technical manual rather than the vagueness of mythology, that this assumption is precisely the misunderstanding that the 8 instructions were designed to correct. The priests were forbidden to read these tablets aloud not because the knowledge was too sacred for ordinary ears, but because it was too consequential for unprepared minds, operating within institutional frameworks that had not yet developed the capacity to receive it without being destabilized by its implications. The question that the evidence now places before us is whether that condition has finally changed,